Namaskar. I, Abhitosh Patnaik, from the Department of Philosophy of Amity Institute of Social Sciences, would like to thank everyone for being here and allowing me to speak. I welcome you today to the National Conference on Science, Technology, and Medicine in the History of Modern India, exploring recent trends, interdisciplinary approaches, and news sources. Today's event is organized by the Department of History of Amity Institute of Social Sciences and is sponsored by the Indian Council of Historical Research. The two-day event, starting today and finishing tomorrow, will focus on the history of three specific areas: science, technology, and medicine. One could very well look at the entire pantheon of history for each, but in this conference, we will be limiting ourselves to the history of modern India. Throughout this conference, we hope to touch upon the following themes: technology and international relations, women in science, technology, and medicine, techno-scientific knowledge production, state, technoscience, and local response, technology, science, and environment, and lastly, public health, disease, and medicine. Now, considering the opportunity that I have, I humbly take a moment to address the unhealthy environment that has festered in India. Though employment is a crucial and needed outcome of receiving education, education itself should not become a means to an end. To do so is to strip education of everything that makes it worthy. And maybe because we have already gutted education, we can now see the gap that has made itself present between people's academic and personal lives. This gap that I speak of is a natural consequence of societies that come to view educational institutions as mere employment factories. At least within the Indian context, education and employment aren't merely synonymous. Instead, they have gone beyond and become the same. The issue of a gap between our personal and academic lives has been brewing for a while. It has reached a point where many of us could perhaps be a part of the problem. And as the story goes, unfortunately, this too, like many others, will be mine and the upcoming generation's burden to bear. We must not merely receive education, but live it. Is that not what our ancient collective past teaches us? It is regrettable that the use of a historical lens in better understanding science, technology, and medicine somehow also means that solely the Amity Institute of Social Sciences, specifically the Department of History, should host this event. Does using a historical lens to investigate science, technology, and medicine necessarily mean that the findings are only valuable to history or social science students? If anything, it is as important, if not more, for the students of science and medicine to heed the historical explorations. That men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons that history has to teach us. Many great thinkers, just like Aldous Huxley in this phrase, have rightly expressed the importance of engaging with history. Despite us being handed on a silver platter the mistakes and triumphs of others, we complacently live our lives without paying attention to them. A lot can be learned from history if only we give it a chance to teach us. It truly is perplexing that we do not. And maybe the notion of the so-called supremacy of the hard sciences can also be attributed to the myopic understanding of education. But let us hastily move past the ramblings of children who have yet to recognize the significance of what other sciences have to offer. The distinct bodies of knowledge, in their way, play a vital role in bettering our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. By relying on different disciplines, we can tap into a vaster and richer reservoir of knowledge while tackling problems. Thus, we must take the time to refer to history in our attempts to understand, but not limited to, science, technology, and medicine. Doing so will only result in a more complete and proper understanding. This session aims to provide a productive environment where we all get the chance to learn something new. We hope that the fascinating new ways to form and develop the history of science, technology, and medicine by referring to the perspectives of other disciplines and the particularities of India's encounter with science, technology, and medicine that will be discussed by our guest speakers will be intellectually stimulating. I thank you once again for being here and letting me speak. May you have a fruitful experience. Now I'd like to invite Katyani Yadav from the Department of History to the lamp lighting ceremony.
Thank you, Abhitosh. Very well spoken. And good morning, everyone. As our devotion to Mother Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom and knowledge, we will now perform our customary auspicious lamp lighting ceremony. It is my privilege to welcome our Head of Institute, Dr. Professor Nirmal Prakash, ma'am, and the convener of this conference, Dr. Madhumita Saha, ma'am, to light the lamp and allow the light of knowledge to dispel the darkness of ignorance. I would request all the dignitaries to please come on the stage and light the lamp. Now for the musical performance, I'd like to invite the choir to the stage and introduce its members. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Anjali Bose, Divya John, Sneha Saira Jacob, and Anushka Singh. I'd like everyone to give them a round of applause.
स्वागतं शुभ स्वागतम् स्वागतं शुभ स्वागतम् आनन्द मङ्गल मङ्गलम् आनन्द मङ्गल मङ्गलम् नित्यप्रियं भारत भारतं नित्यप्रियं भारत भारतम् स्वागतं शुभ स्वागतम् स्वागतं शुभ स्वागतम् नित्य निरन्तरता नमता मानवता समता ममता नित्य निरन्तरता नमता मानवता समता ममता सारथी साथ मनोरथ का जो अनिवार्य नहीं थमता सारथी साथ मनोरथ का जो अनिवार्य नहीं थमता संकल्प अभिजित अभिमतम् संकल्प अभिजित अभिमतम् आनन्द मङ्गल मङ्गलम् आनन्द मङ्गल मङ्गलम् नित्यप्रियं भारत भारतं नित्यप्रियं भारत भारतम् स्वागतं शुभ स्वागतम् स्वागतं शुभ स्वागतम् सुमित नई कामनाएं सुरभित नई साधनाएं सुमित नई कामनाएं सुरभित नई साधनाएं मैत्री मत क्रीड़ांगन में प्रबुदित बंधु भावनाएं मैत्री मत क्रीड़ांगन में प्रमुदित बंधु भावनाएं शाश्वत सुविकसित इति शुभम् शाश्वत सुविकसित इति शुभम् आनन्द मङ्गल मङ्गलम् आनन्द मङ्गल मङ्गलम् नित्यप्रियं भारत भारतं नित्यप्रियं भारत भारतम् स्वागतं शुभ स्वागतम् स्वागतं शुभ स्वागतम्
That was a very beautiful performance by our AISS choir. Thank you so much to all of you. Now, it is my pleasure to invite our guest of honor, Professor Dr. Nirupama Prakash, a sociologist who is the director of AISS, for her welcome address. Earlier, she served in BITS Pilani as Chief Women's Studies and Societal Developmental of Humanistic Studies and Coordinator MPhil Program in Hospital and Health System Management. She taught at the Department of Sociology and Center for International Health, George Washington University, Washington, D.C. Department of Global Gender Studies, University at Buffalo, and at University of Maryland at College Park, USA. We welcome you, ma'am. Also, I would also like to invite Dr. Madhumita Saha, ma'am, to felicitate Dr. Professor Nirupama Prakash, ma'am.
Thank you very much. A very good morning on behalf of Amity Institute of Social Sciences it is my proud privilege to extend a very warm welcome to all the delegates, dignitaries on the dais, to the National Conference on Science, Technology, and Medicine in History of Modern India, exploring recent trends, interdisciplinary approaches, and new resources, which is scheduled to be held today and tomorrow. Our gratitude to Dr. Ashok K. Chauhan, Founder President, Amity Universe, Dr. Atul Chauhan, Honorable Chancellor, Amity University, Uttar Pradesh, and Professor Dr. Balwinder Shukla, respected Vice Chancellor, AUP, for the blessings, encouragement, guidance, and support to all of us to organize this event. The history of science is the history of mankind's unity, goes the quote, of its sublime purpose, of its gradual redemption. The history of science, technology, and medicine should be the leading thread in the history of civilization. The Conference on History of Science, Technology, and Medicine in India will build on existing historiography and seek new ways of writing the discipline's histories. This conference aims to recover the specificities of the Indian experiences of science, technology, and medicine, and engage both with the intellectual histories as well as practices of techno-scientific and medical researchers. It will also focus on topics such as histories of material culture, private corporations, research funding patterns, history of philanthropy, diplomatic history, and the temporal focus of the conference will be on modern India, covering the colonial and post-colonial period. So what is the goal of this conference? It is to find out the role, the process of state formation, modernization, Cold War politics, associated social, economic, cultural, political context played in influencing the trajectory of techno-scientific and medical researchers. So all our resource persons on the dais and online attending the conference will look into how histories of science, technology, and medicine can be more inclusively written by including a more multidisciplinary approach, such as, for example, sociology of science, anthropology, gender studies, post-colonial studies, to name a few. And the broad themes include science, technology, and medicine and construction of history, technology, power and development, public health, disease and medicine, techno-scientific knowledge production, state science and native response, the history of science, technology, and medicine, the confluence, technology and environment, and technology and democracy. I'm sure the deliberations of the conference will lead to fruitful insights and intense learning on the subject. I congratulate the convener, Dr. Madhumita Saha, the entire organizing team, student volunteers, all AISS faculty, staff, and students for organizing this event as a team. Once again, a very warm welcome to all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm here to introduce our Honorable Vice Chancellor, who could not be here, could not be present with us, but Dr. Madhumita Saha will read out the message she sent for us. Honorable Vice Chancellor of Amity University, Noida, Professor Dr. Balwinder Shukla, ma'am. She did her MTech from IIT Kharagpur and PhD from Queen's University, UK. She has over 27 years of experience in industry, academia, research, and administration. She has over 22 years of experience in organizations such as Shimnet Group, Intera Software, IIHT Systems, and Amity Group of Institutions. To her credit, she has presented many papers in seminars and at conferences conducted at national and international level. She has organized over 150 seminars, conferences, and management development programs. Dr. Shukla is also the chairperson of more than 20 committees within Amity and outside. Now I'd like to request Madhumita Saha ma'am to read out the message ma'am sent for us.
As ma'am is abroad, she could not join us for this occasion, but she did send us a very nice, kind message. So I will read out. I take this privilege as the convener of the conference to read this out. Conferences are necessary to bring in a culture of knowledge exchange and feedback on developing trends. I am delighted to share that Amity Institute of Social Sciences, Amity University, Uttar Pradesh, in association with Indian Council of Historical Research and Society for the History of Technology, short USA, is organizing a national conference on science, technology, and medicine in the history of modern India on 21st, 22nd April 2022. This conference will provide a unique platform to researchers, academicians, industry experts, young professionals, scholars, among others, to widen their knowledge domain, explore and exchange different insights, and deliberate on various significant topics related to technology and development, public health, disease and medicine, technoscientific knowledge production, technology and environment, as well as technology and democracy. I am confident that the participants will benefit immensely from the informative sessions by eminent speakers and researchers during the conference. It will induce not only the growth of new ideas, but lead to the beginning of a dialogue between sciences and social sciences. I congratulate Professor Dr. Nirupama Prakash, Head of Institute AISS, along with Dr. Madhumita Saha, convener of the conference, and the entire organizing team of faculty members and students for their remarkable efforts for arranging such a conference. It is only through such dedication and perseverance that one can achieve excellence. I take this opportunity to convey my best wishes to all the participants, distinguished speakers and researchers, and wish them a great learning experience. I wish the conference a grand success. Thank you.
It is my absolute privilege to invite our next guest of honor, Professor Arvind Palmer Mohan, all the way from the eastern coast of the United States. Professor Mohan serves as the president of the Society for History of the Technology, also known as SHOT, which works to encourage the study of the development of technology and its relations to society and culture. Under her able leadership, SHOT is putting in great effort to incorporate the non-Western world within SHOT's fold. She is a Henry Clay Reid Professor of History and also serves as the coordinator of the Hagley Program in the History of Capitalism, Technology, and Culture at the University of Delaware, USA. As a researcher, she analyzes a shifting historical link between mankind and the material realm. Her scholarly work focuses on the history and the development of industrialization, technology, gender, food, and America's post-Civil War development. Some of the well-known books she has written include Stream Laundries, Gender, Technology, and Work in Great Britain and United States, Risk Negotiating Safety in American Society, for which she received the 2014 Ralph Gomery Book Prize Award, Gender and Technology, a Reader, and many more. Welcome, ma'am. It's truly an honor, and thank you for devoting your important time to us.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you to the organizers and especially to Madhumita Saha for the opportunity to address this meeting. I am honored to represent the Society for the History of Technology at this very important conference, and I'm excited by the range of topics represented in the program. I believe that this occasion presents a significant opportunity for SHOT to forge stronger ties with Indian historians of technology and with historians of Indian technology. In the time allotted, I'm here to share the Society for the History of Technology, or SHOT as we call it, vision for creating an international community of history of technology researchers. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the steps we've been taking to make a non-Western perspective central to our field and where we see the field heading. I'm also here with an invitation to you to either join the SHOT community if you're not yet a member, or if you are, to become more involved. So for those of you who are already, some of you are already familiar with SHOT. For those of you who are not, here's a little bit of background. Founded in 1958, SHOT is the largest and oldest learned society dedicated to fostering and disseminating scholarship in the history of technology. SHOT currently has about 2,000 formal members, but during my time as president, I've also learned the actual SHOT community is much larger when you count all the people who interact with the society in a wide range of ways. SHOT's core activities include its annual conference and its flagship journal, Technology and Culture. We also sponsor a variety of other activities, including regional conferences and workshops. In its first decade, SHOT was, as one Swedish member put it, an American organization with a few foreign members. But over the last few decades, it has become quite intentionally international in both participation and outlook. This is reflected not only in our membership, but also in our activities. SHOT had its last in-person meeting in Milan in 2019. That meeting attracted participants from over 40 countries. SHOT's prizes and fellowships are open to scholars from around the world, and we even offer special travel grants for non-American and European scholars who want to attend the annual meeting in person. This push to make SHOT a global organization also extends to the Society's journal, Technology and Culture. The current editor, Ruth Oldenseal, has made it her policy to recruit articles and book reviews from a global network of scholars. The journal provides editorial support for authors who are not native speakers of English or who are unaccustomed to publishing in an American-style journal. The journal also reviews books published in languages other than English. Several new initiatives are now in the works that we hope will make the Society's activities even more accessible to scholars from around the world. These include creating an online conferencing platform that can be used by members for smaller events. We are also negotiating with our publisher to make technology and culture available and affordable in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We're excited to be the co-sponsor of this conference, and in 2023, we will also be the co-sponsors of a large-scale History of Technology conference in Dar es Salaam in Africa. We are partnering with our Latin American colleagues as well for a series of future events. Why put so much effort into internationalizing SHOT? SHOT's leadership and many of its long-term members believe that a global and particularly a non-Western perspective is crucial to the intellectual development of the field. In particular, the field has long included scholars who've argued that what everyone does, not just is technology, not just white, male, highly trained Western experts. A more global perspective challenges all of us to think hard about who counts as a technological actor and to pay attention to technological cultures. And I say that cultures in the plural. A global perspective is also important in maintaining the field's relevance to present day concerns. We know as historians that material technologies and technological ideas have always circulated across national boundaries, but never before at the speed and complexity of the present moment. We also know that both people and technology are transformed in new cultural contexts. Scholars have also shown us that technology can be a powerful tool for maintaining existing power relationships, but it can also be used by ordinary people as a force for change. We need to better understand how this works. Historians are key to this. And I say that this as a historian of US history, whose own perspective has been changed from reading and teaching the growing literature about technology and society outside the West. Much of the Society's recent international efforts have focused on East Asia, especially China and Korea. These efforts have been quite successful. However, as I've told Madhavita, I feel like SHOT is missing out when it comes to India. Shot would very much benefit from building stronger connections with the vibrant community of scholars in India and with the strong technical university system that exists here. So here's my invitation. Become a member of SHOT if you're not already. Consider participating in the annual meeting, COVID permitting. Apply to be an international scholar. Consider submitting your research to Technology and Culture or volunteering to be a book reviewer. Send me an email with your ideas about how SHOT can forge stronger connections with historians of technology in India. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your valuable time and insightful words. It was truly an invigorating speech. Now, it is my immense honor to introduce our next guest of honor, Professor Dr. Dhirendra Dutt Dangwal. Professor Dr. Dhirendra Dutt Dangwal is the Dean of Ambedkar University's School of Liberal Studies in New Delhi. Before joining Ambedkar University as Associate Professor in March 2011, Dr. Dangwal taught in Himachal Pradesh University, Shimla, for more than 8 years. He was a fellow at the Center for Contemporary Studies, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Teen Murti, and a fellow at the National Institute of Science, Technology and Development Studies, New Delhi. He has studied the urban environmental history of the Doon Valley, which is located in the Uttarakhand, Himalayas, Siwalik Hills. He was curious about how urbanization, particularly in environmentally vulnerable areas, impact the natural environment. His PhD dissertation and subsequent research projects focused on the Himalayan region's socio-environmental transition. His area of expertise is environmental history. He has written many influential research papers, book reviews, and also has presented papers at conferences and seminars. Amongst his many famous works are The Himalayan Degradation, Colonial Forestry and Environmental Change in India, which was published in 2009 by Cambridge University Press, India, and a project report titled Scientific Forestry and Sustainable Management of Forests in India, Myth and Reality, submitted to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. We are pleased to have you here with us today, sir. Please, sir, enlighten us with your insights on the topic. But first, with a great pleasure, I would like to welcome my fellow compare, Sejal Kapoor, for felicitating Professor Dr. Dhirendra Dutt Dangwal with a token of gratitude.
Invite our AISS faculty members. I request AISS faculty to please one by one come up when we felicitate the guests. So.
Distinguished dignitaries on the dais, assistants, faculty members, and students. I thank the organizing committee, particularly Dr. Madhumita Shah, for giving me this opportunity. I will be speaking on environmental history, this basically historiography of environmental history in India, and it has a close link with science. It cannot be separated from each other. Environmental history began to be practiced in the USA in the 1960s and 70s, though there were writings prior to that, but it acquired importance and significance and emerged as a subdiscipline of history in the United States of America in the decade of 1970s. Some of the prominent figures who wrote at that time and make significant contribution were people like Roderick Nash, who wrote Wilderness and American Mind, tracing the ideas of wilderness and how those developed, not only in the USA, but globally, he was looking for the ideas of nature. Similarly, Donald Worcester, who has numerous writings, but most prominently the Nature's Economy, where again he looks for the ideas in the culture and the society, that how people looked at the nature and how they perceived environment, and how they were occasion when they put forward their ideas for protection of environment. Similarly, there was remarkable work by Alfred Crosby, which has virtually become a classic, where he demonstrated that how the Europeans' conquest of the New World completely transformed New World ecologically. Not only they took over demographically to those lands, but also in terms of the vegetation and biota, everything was transformed according to European test in those areas, which had a serious ecological impact for those areas. So there are several other works which I would not like to go into. If you look at the India, that although one way one can draw these kind of linkages from elsewhere and the Indian environmental history, however, academia in India first time drew towards environmental issue after the Chipko movement. Chipko movement was in a way eye-opener for academia as well, apart from other activists and other people. And several people from different disciplines attempted to understand it and wrote about it. Some of them were like Anil Agarwal, who later founded Center for Science and Environment. Vandana Shiva, who became famous eco-feminist, Jain Bandhopadhyay, Ghanaian like Anupam Mishra. All these people wrote about Chipko, tried to understand and tried to read the larger meaning that this movement was trying to convey. The person who looked into the historical roots of this movement was Ramachandra Guha in his book, The Unquiet Road, tried to trace, did not study only the movement in that particular duration, but also tried to understand the historical roots of the movement, and argued that in the 19th and 20th century, when the forests came under the control of the British in India, and the way they regulated those forests, people protested against that. The resistance and protest of the communities against the forest regulation was the beginning, according to him, which finally culminated in a way in the Chipko movement. Even before that, Ram Guha, in his writings in the 1983 and thereafter, in a series of articles in Economic and Political Weekly, was basically trying to argue that the forest acts, those were passed, those are very crucial acts which were passed by the British in India, one in 1865 and another in 1878, were very, very important act which played significant role in altering the environment in India, which I will be elaborating in a little while. However, what he argued that the basic objective behind these acts, though British argued that the objective was to conserve forest, was to deprive the communities of their rights and take the control all the forest. And another two issues which were crucial for them, one was to commercialize forest and generate as much revenue as possible. And second was to deprive various communities of their traditional rights so that a more clear control could be exercised over these forests. Thereafter, Gadgil and Guha, Madhav Gadgil, very prominent ecologist, and Ramachandra Guha came together writing their book, This Future Land, An Ecological History of India in 1992, where they argued a crucial thing is that colonial rule represents an ecological watershed in the history of India, which means that never before this kind of ecological devastation was seen in India, and people by and large lived in harmony with nature prior to the colonial rule. That was the main argument of the book, which has been criticized by some scholars. The more prominent scholar who questioned this and argued entirely different position was Richard Grove in his Green Imperialism. Grove argued two things. One, he was arguing that deforestation, which Guha and other people were arguing happened in 19th century, particularly the second part of it and thereafter. He argued that deforestation was not new to India, even in the pre-colonial India or early part of the colonial India, when the colonial rule has not consolidated itself, massive deforestation was already happening in India. And the second argument he's put forward is that colonialism should not be seen only in the terms of the destruction of nature, but what he argued that colonialism had roots of environmentalism in itself. For this, he brings evidence globally from different parts of the world. His primary thesis emerged from small island colonies which European colonized in different parts of the world, Pacific Island, Atlantic, or elsewhere as well, though they were controlling large landmass elsewhere as well. But what he argued that in these small island colonies, the impact of deforestation or any kind of intervention in those island colonies was quickly visible. And he argues that the people whom we call medico-botanists or naturalists were quick to observe these environmental degradation and warn the government and advise government to conservation of forest for the long-term interest of the empires. Otherwise, they argued that there will be droughts, there will be famines, and water sources will dry up if the deforestation occurs such a large scale. These things become quite easily noticeable in small island colonies compared to the large country like India. However, he further carried that argument forward and demonstrated that in India, these naturalists who were appointed, who were placed in various botanical gardens in India, were constantly arguing this thing about India as well. And as a result, I'm cutting short because I have I have to be brief, but what he demonstrated that people like Alexander Gibson and others were constantly arguing with the government to adopt a policy of forest conservation, and the Bombay Presidency government was first to listen this kind of advice and appointed Alexander Gibson as a conservator of forests in 1842, which he see as a very important development. And he, along with Hugh Colgan or Balfour or several other people, were constantly advising government to conserve forest, which he argues, Richard Grove argues, that resulted in forest memorandum signed by the Governor General Lord Dalhousie in 1850s. So these are some of the arguments he put forward. However, Grove himself does not study the development that happened after 1860s, the efforts of the government to control forest or significantly intervene in forest management or commercializing the forest occurs in the second part of the 19th century, which Grove is not examining carefully. Quite contrary to that, Ravi Rajan, in his book Modernizing Nature, argues that the model of the forestry that was brought to India basically developed in Prussia initially under the Kemalist influence, and later on developed in Germany and France as a continental forest, and that model was brought to India. People like Greg Wharton argued that this model, from wherever it was brought, developed its own features and characteristics in India, which was then taken to the various colonies like New Zealand, Australia, many parts of Africa, and even Caribbean islands and USA. So he see it as a very influential development. Benita Damodaran and Rohan D'Souza in their recent book called this forestry as Commonwealth forestry. These are the general initial argument. However, the large number of the historians who closely examine the colonial forest policy in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the impact on the society, argued that the forest policy basically deprived people of their traditional rights and completely disrupted the economy. For example, tribal way of life was completely disrupted by the colonial intervention in forestry. Similarly, people who were practicing pastoralism, nomadism, and all that, those people were restricted from, their movements were restricted, which has a serious impact on those communities as well. My own work on Himalayan region, Uttarakhand particularly, shows that there was a very close linkage between the agrarian economy and the forest prior to the colonial period. People practiced a lot of mobility to use the resources of different altitudes. to maintain environmental sustainability as well as running their economy successfully. However, with coming of the British, a lot of restrictions were imposed on them, and that ultimately resulted in confining people to their farms and adversely affected the ecology, which resulted in soil erosion and significantly harming the traditional ecosystem in which those communities operated prior to that. One of the significant departure from in this field came from Mahesh Rangarajan's work on the wildlife. I will be brief. His two significant contribution were that he argued that that British were first anywhere, first in India, to reward people for killing carnivores. Because they thought that by doing this, there will be possibility of agriculture expansion, and they saw large fauna, particularly predatory fauna, as dangerous for expansion of agriculture, which was the main source of revenue at that point of time. And second thing, he argues that British developed a culture of hunting, where it was a leisure time activities and a kind of sports where they claimed trophies for killing wild animals. And there was a huge competition for killing wildlife on a very large scale, which has a devastating impact on the wildlife in India. And many fauna completely disappeared from large landscape of India. For example, lion remained confined to the Gir forest, that too after the efforts of the princely estate to preserve it primarily for selective hunting. And similarly, one find other large fauna remaining confined to other locations, like rhino remained confined to the Kaziranga National Park. Tiger, which was found in the large part of the India, slowly retreated to a hilly and mountainous region and Tarai regions of India. Similarly, there are several other works which have come on the water. That I will be very brief on this now. One of the most remarkable article is that of the David Hardiman in Nature, Culture and Imperialism, book edited by David Arnold and Ramachandra Guha, very briefly argues that in the Sahyadri Hills in the Bagalan region of Maharashtra, there was a very successful traditional irrigation system was being practiced, which disintegrated for a variety of factors. And later on, British were requested to help in reviving that system, but British did not take any interest in that, because British believed in the use of science and technology and building a large structure, which was their primary focus, which Elizabeth Whitcomb in her excellent work demonstrate that these large canals, rather than helping significantly in irrigation, resulted in a huge land being lost to the waterlogging and to salination, as well as spread of the malaria in these large canals which were built into North India. And similar was the case in the canal colonies in Punjab, where Indo-Agnihotri shows that similar impact of these canal colonies, these canals were visible, and even the distribution of water was not as expected by those who built those canals, because there were power equation which was operating when the distribution to the marginal farmer and to the final target, who were small cultivators, they could not receive the water the way it was expected. In this series of writing on environmental history, one of the remarkable work came in 2019 from Arupjit Jyotish Sekia. He wrote a biography of Brahmaputra. It's an excellent work talking about how culture and economy of the society is shaped by the rivers. There's a huge potential in a similar kind of research being done on other rivers, which will help us to understand how close relationship is there between the human beings and these natural resources, river particularly in this context. Facing environmental change is not so easy. It's a challenge for historian because getting evidence are always very, very difficult. However, they can use agrarian and environmental history together or some other kind of tools to make these issues more visible or able to arrive on certain kind of conclusion which can convince the larger audience. Finally, there's a huge possibility in urban environmental history, which has not been worked enough, except mostly in the field of sanitary work and sanitary writings. However, there's a huge potential. Globally, people have written about it, that how the societies struggle, and no one knows it more than we, who face huge air pollution in Delhi in the winter and other times as well. But particularly in the winter. So each urban area has their own problem to how to deal with with these kind of environmental problem they face, whether it's related to water, whether it's related to disposal of waste, or whether it's related to air pollution and so on. So there's a lot of potential for it, and this kind of work can be really very, very rewarding for historians and for a society as a large. Thank you very much.
I want to extend a sincere gratitude to Dr. Dhirendra Dutt Dangwar. Your enigmatic words inspired all of us who are present here today. It was the most worthwhile experience for everyone to listen to you. Moving on, it is my privilege for me to introduce our next guest of honor, Professor Dr. Subrata Sinha. Dr. Subrata Sinha is the head of Department of Biochemistry at one of India's premier institutions, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. He was awarded MBBS in 1980 and MD in 1983 from AIIMS, New Delhi. Dr. Sinha was an ICMR Talent Search Scheme Fellow at the Department of Biochemistry at AIIMS in 1984, where he later joined as faculty of biochemistry and is now leading the same department. Decorated by several research felicitations at national and international level, Dr. Sinha's research contributions have been well respected in his field. Dr. Sinha obtained his PhD and postdoctoral training at the MRC Toxicology Unit at Carl Charlton, UK, where he was a Smith and Nephew Fellow, formerly the director of National Brain Research Center, an autonomous institute under the Ministry of Science and Technology, Government of India. Dr. Sinha has worked extensively on human tumors and has made several important contributions in this field. Dr. Sinha has served on several scientific advisory committees of DBT and ICMR institutes. He chaired committee of the Medical Council of India for modernizing the biochemistry curriculum. He has been active in introducing molecular medicine and research exposure to MBBS curriculum. He is currently the Vice President of Indian National Science Academy, which is doing a tremendous job at promoting history of science, technology, engineering, and medicine in India. Dr. Sinha is the recipient of several awards and honors, including Fellow of Indian Academy of Neurosciences, Fellow of National Academy of Medical Sciences. He was awarded ICMR Senior Biomedical Fellowship and Swarna Jayanti Fellowship of the Department of Science and Technology. So we are extremely honored and privileged to have you here with us today. I would like to invite you on stage to illuminate us with your views and ideas. Before that, I would like to invite Dr. Richa Kapoor to please come on stage and felicitate Dr. Subrata Sinha.
Yeah. My PowerPoint should be there.
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. And I thank Professor Madhumita Saha and Professor Nirupama Prakash for inviting me here. My regards to the dignitaries on the dais and the dignitaries who are joining us online. I'm not really in the history of medicine, in any form of history, but it's really an honor for me to be a part of this inaugural session of HISTEM, which is organized by the Amity University. What I thought that instead of, I put my thoughts together and I said that, look, the coronavirus has brought, it has amalgamated all sorts of disciplines just for the sake of our survival. So therefore, science, history, sociology, economics, politics, everything has come together when we actually have faced what was a historical scourge in time, pandemics. We had believed that, with pandemic, the age of infectious disease is over. And really, we have conquered everything. Of course, antibacterial resistance, anti-drug resistance of bacteria was creeping up, but we never expected something to draw a focus in such a massive way as this pandemic. So this actually what I'm talking today, I'll try to be brief, but is adaptation of a talk I had given for INSA to tell people when we had a little session on pandemics and coronavirus. So I'll be talking about, there is this endemic and there is this epidemic. And I'm not really a history person, so I try to give my perspective to the whole thing. And I hope some of it, the historical aspects are not too naive for this specialized audience. So what is an endemic disease? Endemic disease is a disease which is regularly found all over India. Tuberculosis is an endemic disease. It is there all over. And, little fluctuations occur here and there, but it's there in India. It's there in many developing countries. And now with HIV, actually it's refound itself in the developed world. We have epidemics. What is an epidemic? Epidemic is a disease which sort of comes up and hopefully disappears. So we are all waiting for corona to disappear. We never had this virus, but we've had this huge increase, sudden increase in number of cases. And a pandemic, of course, is a global epidemic which spreads to more than one continent. So now, what happened? When we are looking at coronavirus, one very interesting thing came up. The combination of science and archaeology and to bring together the history of pandemics, not just recorded history, but before recorded history. So apparently, and population growth, there was a sudden population growth in the New Stone Age, Neolithic, and then this was followed by a sudden drop in the population. Now, there's been a lot of speculation as to why it happened. And there are sites in Northeast China, for example, where 100 bodies have been found burned together and the site abandoned. And similar, during this course of time, there are many cases to be found. So DNA is a very, useful tool. You have heard that ancient DNA, now we know even, I think over 1,000 genomes of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans have been sequenced, and they are there on the website for all of you to study. So similar a site where there was apparently a pandemic and lot of deaths, and there were some burnt bodies found, was studied in Sweden. And along with human remains, what they could actually find was the plague bacillus. So the DNA of the plague bacillus was identified from this site in Sweden, and the toxin gene, which actually causes the deaths in plague, that was identified. And so we actually have the first recorded history of a pandemic which has occurred before, several thousand years ago. And one of the reasons for these pandemics in that period of time was a rapid growth in population, the overcrowding of settlements, animal husbandry. So all these conditions, which are suitable for the explosive burst of an infectious disease, were present for the first time. Now, naturally, we have to live with this, and we have to learn to live with these pandemics. And historically, the world has been living with these pandemics. You see, at that time, we now know that most of the historical pandemics many of them have been caused by the plague bacillus. Now, because of perhaps antibiotics, perhaps because of the way we live, it's less frequent. But again, this is not my area, but apparently the Justinian plague, which spread from in 541 AD from Central Africa to Egypt to the Mediterranean, South Europe, Asia, Constantinople, and now Istanbul was the focus of this, and it killed 1/3 of its population. In 1347 AD, the Black Death spread from Asia to Crimea and Europe and Russia, and lots of the population, a huge number of people had died. And obviously, these have had impacts on history. These have had impacts on the survival of empires, which you perhaps know better than what I could ever comprehend. But at that time, we were thinking of pandemics as a punishment from God, the vapors coming in, miasmas from infected bodies, associated them with earthquakes, comets, and planetary conjunctions. And when we compare that and how scientifically we have been able to at least understand it, coronavirus, and to tackle it in the short space of 3 years, that seems to be, on one hand, a technological leap. On the other hand, actually sociologically, and we have really not learned the lessons of history, perhaps, that we should have, but then that's how we are as a human race. This is it. So some of the things that you see today, distance, a mask, this is a mask, which I got a picture from Creative Commons. So prevention of contact between infected and non-infected people was really known for a long time. And, sometimes it was very obvious. People were affected with leprosy. Leprosy we don't see very much, but these people obviously had visible lesions, and in a way they were socially ostracized also. So there's this, while the population took steps to protect itself, there's always this issue of discrimination and other things, which we have also seen during this coronavirus epidemic, when even health professionals were really discriminated against. I remember that when India had a plague epidemic in the 90s, there was this person who was investigating the plague epidemic from NICD. His life in his housing society became difficult. So in one way, many things haven't changed, even though we know so much. In Venice, people knew that Venice was a center of trade, and that ships used to come from far away, and some would be infected. And they were told to anchor off the shore for 14 days. And apparently, this is what I learned, that quarantina or quarantine comes from this distancing, that they keep the person separate till they expect that, if he is infected or she is infected, the infection will show up and the person may get cured, may die. And so there were 2 islands, one for where the infected people were isolated, and one where the ships were anchored before it came on. And then there were many infections, so I'll not go into details. But one thing, let's understand that how we have started understanding the causative reasons for these pandemics. And this is Leeuwenhoek's microscope, which again, of course, you all know, and this is a primitive microscope. And the other thing that we have learned from these many pandemics, especially the plague pandemics, is the importance of zoonotic transmission. So in health, now we had a very illuminating lecture on the one aspect of ecology, but one of the effects of destruction of forests is that zoonotic diseases, or diseases that jump species from animals to man, have suddenly again started, well, not suddenly, many of them were there earlier. Influenza is there in animals as well as us. Plague has actually, it has a zoonotic transmission. The rat and the flea are part of its cycle for transmission. So we are interconnected to animals, which is one other aspect. We are interconnected to the environment. So this is one aspect, again, which we tend to lose sight of in our very human-centric, technology-centered era. And this is from the third pandemic. actually the causative organism, Yersinia pestis, could be isolated. And there are different kinds of plagues were identified. And once we've understood the mechanism of, let us say, transmission, we were able to also deal with the organism. So what are the scientific advances that made these discoveries possible? Starts off with physics and laws of optics, lens grinding and microscopy, techniques to culture bacteria and detailed observations, germ theory of disease, pastures, and Robert Koch's postulates of how actually you can identify an infectious disease. So we would like to link all these together. And another pandemic that India has been very much affected is cholera. And mind you, the preventive measures and the fact that water supply is the source of cholera, we could actually, the human race could reduce the incidence of cholera and control cholera wherever there was technological feasibility before we knew the causative organism. So this is something that, we talk today of social interventions, non-pharmacological interventions. These have had a historical basis earlier. You all know that, epidemiologically, it was traced to an infected water hand pump in London. And thus the water, how it spread through water could be found out. And in India, we've had major epidemics. We have had a major cholera pandemic in 1817, 1829, 1852, 1863, 1881, 1889. So you see a series of pandemics in India. Actually, cholera has affected the history of India to a remarkable extent. We've had plague in Bombay, Spanish flu in 1918. And importantly, we've had this smallpox epidemic from 1970 to 1990, which is now eradicated in India effectively. Polio epidemic. And polio is now only present in some areas of the world. The smallpox epidemic, in 1974, 85% of the worldwide cases were from India. 15,000 deaths. As in 1974, I passed my higher secondary exam. So even though it might sound very historical to many of the young students here, it's not really that far away. And we've been able to really take care of smallpox. It's one of the few diseases which has been eradicated. In fact, two, only smallpox and to some extent with caveats polio. There was an outbreak of plague. Recent epidemics have been there. There's been AIDS pandemic from 1981, it came up to the present day. The H1N1 swine flu pandemic, the SARS-CoV-1, before SARS-CoV-2, which is the current one, we've had a SARS-CoV-1 pandemic. The only redeeming feature of this SARS-CoV-1 is that it doesn't spread so actively as SARS-CoV-2. So SARS-CoV-2 has really evolved in order to spread better. MERS, Middle East respiratory virus, Zika virus epidemic continuing, West African Ebola virus still continuing in spurts all over the place. So one thing, please understand, many of these epidemics which come, maybe they die down in numbers, they don't really go away. We have to learn to live with them. And there the lessons of history become important. So this is just a list of the various smaller outbreaks and epidemics that we've had in India: dengue, SARS, meningococcus, chikungunya, dengue again, Gujarat jaundice, H1N1. There's one jaundice outbreak in Odisha, swine flu. Now there's Nipah virus. So these outbreaks keep coming, and depending on the size or the number infected, they are called either outbreaks or they are called epidemics or pandemics, whatever you call it. But before I conclude, you see, I'd like to you to take home one very interesting thing. It's taken us years and millennia to understand some diseases. So somewhere the technology comes in. One hand, you see how technology can be used to study archaeology, and you could isolate the plague toxin gene from a Paleolithic skeleton. I mean, that is one aspect. today's aspect, in less than 1 year for SARS-CoV-2, we know that it's a virus. For HIV, it took us 5-6 years before we could finally settle down that it is really a virus. It's not something. Otherwise, there was some very bizarre ideas floating about. They seem bizarre today. By that time, by the 1980 logic, they were not. That homosexuality actually reduces your, the way you immune presentation. I mean, and these were seriously discussed. Why? Because that was an idea at that time with that knowledge worth discussing. So we know it's causative organism, we know the methods of prevention, laboratory diagnosis, improved clinical management, possible drugs, vaccine. This is the fastest in any disease. This has happened in less than the first, the rudiments at least were there, or in fact, a lot of it was there in the first year of the disease. So this is the speed by which technology can actually deal with pandemics. In the last 3 years, it's been around. We know about boosters. Today, again, we are getting, this coronavirus is making a comeback. It's going up and down, up and down. But I think because of vaccinations and infections, we are protected, much better protected as far as our health goes. But there are still many things we don't know. Long COVID, how COVID actually affects the other organ systems of the body, affects the heart, affects heart attacks, strokes, liver failures, cancers. These things we don't know much about. We don't know the long-term effects of COVID. And it's getting very difficult to study because we are still at a stage where, we are making these tentative hypotheses and we can't really generate a firm research conclusion on that. So these are some eye-openers that I want at least the students may want to take home, that infectious diseases are not a part of history that we can forget. So they are very much there with us. And of course, now it has been hammered onto us, something that we had forgotten. Lessons of how we have tackled respiratory infections over the ages are still valid today. Some simple public health measures like mandating windows has had a dramatic effect on the prevalence of TB in USA. Combined town planning, architecture, and public health. Science we can use to mitigate. How society responds to diseases in the community. Do we ostracize the victims? Going around how we reacted to the corona, have we really progressed? In some ways, we really have not. What's the social structure and disease? How does it affect us? Aspects of health access and inequality, have they changed? Are they better? Are they worse? Zoonosis, the environment. Most of these current pandemics that we know have some animal origin or source or the other, which is attributed to two aspects, essentially, very superficially, I'll say, ecological destruction and global warming. And obviously climate change and disease. So we need an integrated approach with historians, social scientists, and natural scientists coming together. And we need more and more of that. There is an INSA program in the history of science, which I think, but I feel that the Indian Council of Historical Research also, I'm really happy that they have sponsored this conference. So with this, thank you very much for having me here, and I'd acknowledge Dr. Tapasya and Dr. Karthikeyan, who has helped me prepare this. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Sinha for such an enlightening presentation. I would now like to welcome our next guest of honor, Professor Dr. Ashutosh Sharma. Professor Dr. Ashutosh Sharma is presently an Institute Chair Professor and the C.V. Seshadri Chair Professor at Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, Department of Chemical Engineering. He is a visionary academician who has made significant interdisciplinary contribution in nanosciences. From 2015 to 2021, he led the Department of Science and Technology, Government of India, as a secretary of the department. Under his esteemed leadership, India entered an illustrious phase of scientific development on the national and international stage. Heading the Department of Science and Technology, he was the backbone of several new programs related to infrastructure and human capacity building, innovation and startups, research and development in advanced manufacturing, waste processing, and cyber physical systems. His contribution to the field is beyond any verbal expression. Thank you, sir, for being here today and bestowing upon us your valuable presence. I would now request sir to kindly share his inspiring thoughts with us.
Thank you. I'm so delighted that that MIT University and Dr. Madhumita Saha and her team are organizing this very important symposium, the conference, which brings together several different themes. So you see science, engineering, technology, medicine, history, and all the rest of these keywords that I find in the title of this conference, which set me thinking that, well, we talk a lot about being interdisciplinary or being multidisciplinary. In fact, it's so fashionable now to talk about out of disciplinary, meta-disciplinary, no disciplinary, and so on, and beyond disciplinary. This is all a little bit amusing, in fact, because I think it's a huge misunderstanding. The huge misunderstanding is that we first fragmented knowledge in 1,000 different ways, that we made so many different compartments of it, which was very good because it serves the purpose of undergraduate education. It provides an identity to the people for them to find the next job, which is most appropriate for them in terms of their background and skills. But if you were to look at producing new knowledge, if you were to look at solving problems, then it doesn't do very much actually to talk about so many different disciplines, because when you want to solve a problem, and I would very quickly come to some of the overarching problems of the future and indeed of today, that basically requires that we be 100% interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. So the whole concept of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary comes about because we first divided knowledge into smaller bits and pieces. And now to solve a problem, we need to bring them together again. And now fragmentation, as we know in science and technology, is a lot easier process than bringing it together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, if you would. It doesn't always fit. It requires tremendous amount of patience, energy, work to be done in order to make the fuller picture. So I'm very glad that we are actually discussing things which are so hugely interdisciplinary. Now, so I talked to Madhumita Saha and I said, what is it you want me to talk about? Certainly, I will not talk about nanotechnology or some specific aspect of science and technology, and indeed its history, because you can always go to a specialized conference to learn more about that. So what is it we want to talk about? So she said, oh, you can talk about science and society or some such thing. Okay, so that basically means that it takes about 30 hours, not 10 minutes to do that. But so let us look at that very fascinating theme about science and society, if you would, again, because we have divided something as science and something as society. And now we say, look, how do we bring them together? Okay, fair enough. So, so I say, look, the first question I ask is, of course, the first question I ask is in the context of the talk today, is indeed what is history? So history is not just what happened yesterday in the past. History is a dynamic thing in making, because today is the yesterday of tomorrow. Today is the history of tomorrow. And in fact, what we write today would make the history. So it's not to be thought of as a static entity, but as something very dynamic, reaching out to future. In fact, I could also philosophically argue that future is also history of today. but we'll not have time to go into that. That's not the theme of this conference. So we'll move on and say, ask the question about how does science reach the society? What is the interface between science and society? So of course, the science translates first. If you, of course, the science is part of also that fundamental knowledge, which means producing new knowledge. But beyond that, how does it connect with the society at large and its different components? So then you have to say, look, science first translates into some kind of engineering in terms of technology, in terms of product, in terms of processes, and then it reaches society. How does it reach society? It goes through industry primarily. Okay, and which is why the history of science and technology actually is also intimately tied with the history of various industrial ages, starting from industry 0 to industry 4.0 that we find ourselves in now, and going beyond to industry 5.0. Of course, I would skip all that because there are so many thousands of books and dissertations about how industrial ages reflect in the society, how they reflect the symphony between science, society, and industrial ages, if you would. They affect each other in a very profound way, indeed tune each other in a very profound way. Okay, so it reaches through industry, and of course industry 0 was just based on the control and movement of muscle, the brute force, if you would. The might is right. And industry 4.0 now is a convergence of communication, computing, cyber, digital, physical, biological, computing at edge, autonomous decision making through artificial intelligence, and autonomous action through actuators. So what is the industry 4.0 of today is basically convergence of different streams of science and technology coming together in a seamless way. And that, of course, would be the history for tomorrow, when eventually the biological and the life is also integrated into this domain of cyber and physical, which throws away very, very grand challenges for who we are and how we would continue to function. In terms of identity of humans and so on, very large questions, and we don't have time to get into it now, but just to say, okay, so one way science evolves into technology, evolves into products and processes, and reaches societies through industry. It's also now through startups and so on. It's also through non-governmental organizations, not-for-profit organizations, NGOs. It also reaches through, of course, the transmission of knowledge happens through education, school to college education. It happens through research, that interface, and so on. So these are the different ways in which science interfaces with society. And finally, through scientific communication. We scientists on the whole has often ignored the role, a very prominent, very compelling role for science communication to people at large. Of course, we do science communication to our peer group by writing scientific papers, which is okay. I mean, a typical scientific paper is written by people, is read by people who are doing similar research on an average by one or cited by one researcher in his lifetime. So which is good, I have nothing against it. But a whole lot of this stuff, as indeed the pandemic has shown, that it all depends on coming together. It depends on the coming together, not just of science, technology, product and processes, which are of course necessary, but other foundational stones, which are equally necessary. And these foundational stones that have to work together with science, technology, and medicine are basically communication to society at large, to different stakeholders in a language in which they understand it and can translate in their own life. And of course, the policy, and of course, the rules and regulations, and all of that actually playing together make it possible for science to permeate the society, to have any relationship, to translate science into action. So if I were to, let us say, very quickly point out what are the ingredients which require science to reach the society, is basically, of course, good science which translates into technology, into action, into products, which means that science has some relevance and direction. Now, I just take a breathing space here, because that's the direction, that relevance for science. It does not come from the lab itself. It comes from the society, which means a very good dialogue which is ongoing between society, not just industry, but all sections of society with science. So that is one. Then, of course, the policy matters, rules, regulations, laws, but at the same time, the will of the society at large. And all of these things we have seen in action during pandemic. So will of the society, the cultural aspects, if you would, the socio-cultural aspects, together with the psychological aspects, play a very, in fact, overwhelming role about how effective our science is going to be for solving the problems. Now, talking about the problems, let's look at what these overarching problems are of today and tomorrow. In fact, all the foreseeable future of humanity on planet Earth. So these problems, it was mentioned, for example, of course, we are still not out of this pandemic, the horrible stuff that's been going on for last 2 years. And of course, this is not the first and the last, as Dr. Subrato already pointed out, Dr. Sinha, that, okay, pandemic, they will keep coming back at us more and more, perhaps, together with, there's the eco dynamics of the planet changes. So another overarching problem is, of course, what is called the sustainability, and together with what is called sustainable development, which to my mind is an oxymoron. So sustainable development is an oxymoron because the way we define development in the modern context, the modern economics, if you would, of the Chicago School of Economics, which is about a century or some old, it's a very different way of looking at life and its purpose, if you would, and actually what makes people happy and so on. So anyway, so a huge challenge ahead of us is what is called sustainability and sustainable development. The third overarching challenge is the rise of intelligent machines. In other words, as I pointed out, the convergence of cyber, physical, and biological. And this actually would necessitate us to redefine the identity of humans and their purpose in life. Make no mistakes about it. Okay, and it would impact every aspect of our lives, which means while this problem in its foundation may be science and technology, but actually in all its ramifications and how you would actually address it, whether it is impact on the systems of governance, on the systems of economy, on who I date, how I date, who I marry, what food I eat, where I travel, how I lead my life, all of that is going to have untold consequences, and people would have to be totally prepared in terms of not just the future of education, jobs, and skills, but in terms of future of ethics, or the future of everything that humankind has evolved on, okay, in terms of ethics, aesthetics, everything, whether we play chess or we don't play chess. So these are some of the challenges of tomorrow, together with globalization, the winds of globalization, which means, that my competition is no longer with my immediate neighbor, which means that, a professor in India may still have to compete with a professor in MIT in order to keep his or her livelihood going in an effective way. So, okay, climate change, we know that, and so on. And of course, the rise of antimicrobial resistance and so on. Very tall challenges. And let me again reiterate that these challenges are not only challenges of science and technology. In a sense, they are challenges of science and technology playing together with the very underlying culture, socio-economic aspects, cultural aspects, and psychological aspects of society at large, which are also reflected, therefore, in policies, in rules, regulations, in laws, and general acceptability of who we are and what we do. Now, I would like to conclude quickly because we would run out of time. Each of these things that I introduced actually require a symposium or a conference, a 3-day conference, if you would, in its own right. But let us see, okay, what are the things that we can quickly do? So just to give you a few examples of how Department of Science and Technology put out together some of the new programs and schemes to deal with some of the aspects of how science and society get together and work together. Okay, so as I pointed out, that one of the major interfaces between science and society is, of course, industry, and which, of course, means that the direction and relevance of our research has to come from outside of itself. It has to come from outside of university, which means a push for knowledge creators and knowledge consumers to work together. Now, please remember a whole lot of time when we are discussing things, saying why our science is not working for us, even though India is number 3 in terms of number of scientific publications in the world, we often don't see its translation into practice. And so this has to do with the fact that the interface, the give and take between the knowledge creators and knowledge consumers is rather weak or non-existent. So of course that these interfaces have to be created. In other words, I often explain it to kids by saying, hey, goddess Saraswati, goddess Lakshmi. Okay, they have to work together for their own good. Okay, I mean, so each one of them recognizes the fact that it is for their own good that they have to work together. In other words, creating knowledge and consuming knowledge. As you consume more knowledge, you create new resources for more knowledge creation. So it is what I call sustainability of knowledge. In other words, if you just keep creating knowledge, but you cannot consume it, then you have no further resources to create new knowledge. So other words, knowledge consumption, which creates new socioeconomic opportunities, is what keeps the knowledge circle going. And so therefore, the invention and innovation have to work together. Innovation is creating new, invention is creating new knowledge. Innovation is consuming that knowledge in order to generate new opportunities. So now what is happening that is require a big push for innovation and startups, for example, because they make use of knowledge and create new opportunities. So as you know that there are several, well, I don't have time now. If you were to look at new programs of DST in the last 6 years or so, the program called Nidhi, the program called Manak. Manak basically introduces the idea of innovation at a very early stage in schools. We have to catch them young because nobody, all our teaching is about transmitting knowledge. All our teaching is about, at the most about research, which means producing knowledge and transmitting it. But nobody talks about how we are going to be consuming this knowledge eventually. So this is the Manak program reaches 5 lakh schools in the country. And based on, basically scouting for innovative ideas, then making it possible for them to be translated into prototype. So something like 1 million ideas, new ideas every year, of which 100,000 new ideas are basically rewarded and they can be converted into prototypes and so on. And so basically introducing some aspects of innovation and startups in school. Nidhi, of course, it basically supports incubators, it supports startups and so on. I'm happy to report that in the last 5 years, the startups supported by Department of Science and Technology produced new wealth of about 30,000 crores, and it created 1 lakh new direct jobs. If we were to count indirect jobs, which means once the startups graduate out of incubators and become mature, then that kind of impact is actually phenomenal. Right? But just while these people are graduating, they have already created new wealth of about 30,000 crores. So every rupee that government spends in enhancing the uptake of knowledge as startups, Every rupee that's spent by the government produces new wealth of about 30 rupees. Okay, so time for startup and innovation has come. It's no longer about the lip service and so on. I would now stop because I really have to. My 15 minutes are over by 2 more minutes. So those of you who have interest in looking at the policies and how they work for you, okay, how they can actually, they empower, they muscle our science and technology. You can look up the draft policies which are put up on Department of Science and Technology website. There is a policy and guidelines for scientific social responsibility, which is closest to the theme that we are talking about. Scientific social responsibility, if you were to explain in one sentence, it is about saying, look, we as scientists, what do we have at our disposal that we can take to society? So we have knowledge, we have information, we have data, we have manpower, we have human resources, we have infrastructure, science technology infrastructure, which can be used by MSMEs, can be used by startup industry, whoever, right? We have all of these resources. Now, using these resources, if we were to empower any section of society, be it farmers, be it women living in small towns, be it school students, be it MSMEs, be it startups, be it any of these people that we don't directly interface with. If we were to serve these people with the tools at our disposal, then this counts for scientific social responsibility. And I'm very glad to tell you that it receives very enthusiastic response because a whole lot of us as scientists also want to contribute to this particular aspect. There is a science communication program for PhD students and postdoc, which is called AVSAR. And this AVSAR program is receiving about 5,000 popular science stories that are written by PhD students based on their area of research. And again, you see that this brings in huge value. It basically trains our PhD students to value the application of their knowledge. And at the same time, of course, it benefits the reader. There are other, there's an overarching policy in science, technology, and innovation, which is around the corner. You can see the draft of it again on Science and Technology Ministry's website, and so on. So I would conclude indeed just by saying that science technology work best, okay, when they are understood in their societal context, when they can indeed be applied in that context, and whatever that it takes to enable that is also somewhat the responsibility of scientists like us. At the same time, when I say science, actually, I mean something very general. This includes social science. In fact, to my mind, it also includes humanities. So while we have made those fragments, and we often think they can't work together, and we often think that they are at cross purposes, nothing would be farther from truth. So therefore, just science, which translates into technology, that also reaches the understanding and action by society at large is where we need to be. And so science, technology in action is too important to be left only to industry, to be left only to the government, to be left only to scientists, and so on. And so time has come that we really thought very deeply about these aspects and holistically, seamlessly work together. And not as a lip service, but by these deep understanding that we have to be together in this as problem solvers. Thank you very much, Madhumita. Thank you.
I can't thank you enough, sir. We'll talk later.
Thank you for your valuable time and words, sir. To all the esteemed guests who have joined us today for this conference, I would like to tell you a bit about the Honorable Chancellor of Amity University, Dr. Atul Chauhan. Among many of his commendable achievements, Dr. Chauhan is the president of the non-profit Ratinan Balved Education Foundation, which is the leading non-profit Indian foundation for philanthropy, education and development, and as well as the CEO of the AKC group of companies. He is also a distinguished fellow of the Institute of Directors and a member of the expert committee of UGC. An evident source of his excellent leadership lies in his educational background, holding multiple degrees in engineering, accounting and finance, and international business from prestigious institutions like University College London, London School of Economics, and Frankfurt International School. Even though he could not join us today for this conference, his leadership and vision are still guiding us throughout. It is through his inspiring leadership that Amity University has seen such a huge amount of progress, and it continues to strive for academic excellence, creating a distinguished for itself in the world. And this conference is a reflection of his dream. Thank you.
We would like to express a sincere gratitude towards our Honorable Founder President, Dr. Ashok Kumar Chauhan, Sir. Dr. Ashok Chauhan, Sir, is also the Founder President of Reethnand Balved Education and a renowned educationist, industrialist, and a philanthropist. Under his leadership, Amity Education Group has grown into India's leading global education group. His omnipresence at Amity and blessings has been the driving force behind the success. This national conference is a small contribution towards the realization of Founder President Sir's vision of making Amity University a global contender institution into the field of knowledge. Now I invite Katyayani on stage to introduce Dr. Prakash Kumar.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Prakash Kumar, who is joining us all the way from the historical state of Pennsylvania. Dr. Kumar is a notable scholar in agricultural history. Before coming to Penn State University, Dr. Kumar taught at Colorado State University in the Department of History. He is a co-chair of the History of Science Societies Committee on the Meetings and Programs, a member of the Societies for the History of Technologies Editorial Committee, as well as Fulbright US Scholar to India. He authored Indigo Plantations and Science in Colonial India, published by Cambridge University, 2012, which is a social history entered on indigo. Other than the monographs, Dr. Kumar has written extensively on modernization and agrarian development in India. The role of the American modernizers and the cow question in a colonial and nationalist India, and numerous more, are among his publications. All of his work has been published in reputable publications all around the world. The subject of Dr. Kumar's keynote address today will be Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University and the development of Tarai. Welcome, sir. It is an honor to have you with us and giving you valuable time. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. I really consider it a privilege to speak on this forum. And good morning to everyone. It's really bright and early here. That's why I'm stuck here in the basement trying not to wake up the rest of my family. I'm extremely pleased to be presenting my work in Noida, rather virtually addressing an audience in Noida, because Uttar Pradesh is the region of my current research focus. Time is short, so let me straight away get into the title of my paper, which is, as was just said, Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University and the Development of Tarai. I focus on Tarai because as part of Western UP, Tarai became a segment of the Green Revolution story in India, Harit Kranti, agricultural development. And I focus on Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University because this university took upon itself the burden of bringing the Green Revolution. And in the process, it became an instrument for implementing the will of the post-colonial state. And that's important. Let me just clarify the two things that are included, or rather the three things which are included in the title. When we speak about Tarai, we are talking about the historical late 19th and early 20th century Nainital Tarai, the geographical region roughly between Haldwani Bareilly Road on one side and Dimri River on the other side. say we are talking about the Haldwani-Rudrapur region as a rough geographical reference. When we speak about development, we're talking about development as social scientists and humanists. In particular, we are talking about the historical development as a project initiated by the state and bureaucratically implemented. And Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University, its current name is different. Now it is the Govind Ballabh Pant University of Agriculture and Technology, still at Rudrapur, established in 1960. And this was India's first agricultural university, and it was established with active assistance of University of Illinois. So those are the basic facts about this story, about this historical story. Green Revolution, I need not explain a whole lot to this audience, but Green Revolution was the project launched specifically in the time window 1964 to 66, bringing in high yielding variety seeds or HYV seeds, which arguably led to India becoming a food secure nation. Green Revolution was a technological project involving high yielding variety seeds. It was also an exercise in political economy. It involved states' assurance of a package program. What was the package program? Package program involved subsidies for seeds, subsidized electricity for tube wells, and to bring in underground water for irrigation, subsidized fertilizers, pesticides, state support in creating mandis network, rural electrification, rural roads network to take produce to markets, easy credit facilities to farmers, and MSP, minimum selling price. A guarantee that the state would purchase the crops farmers were encouraged to produce, again by the state. So state has an overwhelming presence in all of this. And that's something that historians of South Asia have focused a lot on, the nature of post-colonial state. How did we come to have the kind of state that we have? It has a certain colonial lineage, an overexpansive state. We have inherited the same state. So when we talk about post-colonial state, that is the historiographical grounding. Again, Nainital Tarai, the late 19th and early 20th century Nainital Tarai is broadly the Haldwani-Rudrapur region as a rough geographical reference. Let's call Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University UPAU. What does UPAU's history in Tarai allow us to do? One, it allows us to explore the political and institutional context of the technology of Green Revolution. Two, it allows us to understand the nature of India-US relationship in the context of agricultural technology of the Green Revolution. UPAU was set up after the American land grants model. It was set up, as I said, with the assistance of University of Illinois and became India's first agricultural university. So US-India entanglements were responsible for the birth of this university and for its nature and for the work that it did in a very self-conscious and deliberate way. Three, examining the history of Green Revolution in Tarai allows us to explore the broader ecological history of Tarai. Nainital Tarai is primarily the foothills of the Himalayas, or more specifically, the foothills of Shivalik Range. This was originally a forested and grassy area. We're talking about Kumaon and Garhwal. Now, the historical understanding, to give a historical pitch here or a historical context here, Kumaon and Garhwal were, first of all, occupied by the British Raj in 1815. And after occupation, the Garhwal region, which is Dehradun, Rishikesh, Haridwar, was restored to the Tehri state, the princely state, the Parmar rulers. Rest of this area, it's a large sprawling area, not just Nainital. Nainital district was huge, Before that, the Kumaon Commissionary was huger, even more huge. The rest of this region was put under Kumaon Commissioner. And the Kumaon Commissioner had his head office in Nainital. Now, this history also gets implicated in colonial history of forest conservancy. After 1878, forest laws were introduced, which divided the forests of the region into three categories: reserved forest, protected forest, and village forests. And forestry laws were primarily directed towards conservation of forests resources for use by the colonial state. There was another thing that the colonial state was trying to do in this area. From mid-19th century, under Sir Henry Ramsay, later on, agriculture was also promoted in the area. Agriculture was promoted so that revenue could be extracted. The area geographically comes as two conjoined distinct areas. The Bhabar, which is the rocky area with more or less river sandy soil, about an inch, which is closer to the foothills, places like Haldwani. And then the Tarai proper, which is away from the hills, mountains, the flats, the Rudrapur area broadly. So when we look at Nainital Tarai in historical terms, we're talking about all these areas. And my paper is more or less focused more on the larger Rudrapur area, now under Udham Singh Nagar district, a new district created under Chief Minister Mayawati. This Tarai has an interesting agroecological history. And for that, we have to go back to its colonial period. After First World War, ex-servicemen, that is Indian soldiers who fought the World War on behalf of Royal Army, British Royal Army, were recruited from this region, from two regiments or battalions in particular, Royal Garhwal Rifles and Kumaon Rifles. When the First World War ended, they were disbanded, but they were brought to Kumaon under settled colonial policy and given land to farm. I have done research on Kumaon Soldiers Settlement Estate, a sprawling more than 3,182 acre farming area rather. The story was repeated at the end of Second World War. A bigger number of soldiers were settled over Tarai, which was covered with grass and swamps. It was cleared with the help of Central Tractor Organization. But then came partition, 1947. A huge number of Hindu and Sikh displaced refugees from West Pakistan mostly, but some also from East Pakistan, were brought to settle in Tarai. So this state policy of settling soldiers and refugees turned them into what I call development subjects of development measures. As this area became a symbol of Green Revolution agriculture and success as part of Western UP, new kinds of narratives emerged that celebrated the prowess and ambition of displaced refugees who did well for themselves. The Green Revolution came on the backs of soldier farmers and refugee farmers, Sikh and Hindu farmers from Pakistan. It was connected to the development of an agrarian identity of Jat farmers, all of whom were targets of state's goals for development and were supported, cajoled, and encouraged to farm in a particular way. Green Revolution is an agriculture of a particular kind. There is an ecological side to it. As this prior forested and grassy area was turned into a farmed area, this land was divided along grid lines and given in 10-acre plots to soldiers and refugees. It brought consequences for the ecology of sub-Himalayan regions. And that is why Green Revolution technology is complicit in the ecological history of this region. In all of this economic and social process of Green Revolution technology, Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University participated. Let's focus on UPAU, Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University, for a minute to see what is at stake in its history. There is a way to tell the history of UPAU by focusing on its executive head, the vice chancellor, what we call the president here in United States. The first vice chancellor of this august university was K.A.P. Stevenson, an Anglo-Indian ICS officer. Its second VC, vice chancellor, was a political appointee, a Congress leader from Himachal Pradesh, Raja Bajrang Bahadur Singh. He was dismissed within a year and a half by Sucheta Kriplani, the state's chief minister. For those of you who follow, I'm digressing, if you have interest in local elections in UP, Raja Bajrang Bahadur Singh is the grandfather of current UP political leader, Raja Bhaiya. The man at the center of this project of launching green revolution in the nation was Mr. Dhyan Pal Singh, who was the vice chancellor of this university from 1966 to 75. He was an ICS officer who became the third VC of this esteemed university. I'll say a little bit more on him in a bit. But the switch between trained ICS officers and political appointees at UPAU speaks to the constant struggle between a technocratic vision and a political vision in which UPAU was caught up. I don't use the word political in a narrow or a pejorative way. Political vision as in representing concrete political interests of peasants, farmers, landowners, political interests of Jats from Punjab or Western UP, that kind of political vision. So as a state-funded university, UPAU was never situated away from state's explicit or tacit politics. Indeed, it was due to this state's, UP's, agricultural minister in the 1960s, Charan Singh's support that UPAU took on the mantle of a particular kind of agricultural program. This agricultural program was focused on peasant proprietors or cultivators. What does that mean? It was a loaded term for Charan Singh's politics. It meant cultivators freed from intermediaries, zamindars. It meant cultivators with access to markets through mandis. Charan Singh was instrumental in both. He was behind UP Zamindari Abolition and Land Reform Act of 1950. And he was also behind building off the mandi system in Western UP in the 1950s and 1960s, fashioned after Sir Chotu Ram and Pratap Singh Karon's mandi system in the Punjab. To return to UPAU's third vice chancellor, Dhyan Pal Singh, DP Singh was dynamic, believed in the power of HYV or high-yielding variety seeds, and he wanted to turn Tarai into what he called a garden for production of HYV seeds. He had a reputation as an efficient officer. He was well adept at implementing colonial law and colonial policies. We historians have talked of the steel frame of the ICS regime during colonial times. After independence, Dhyan Pal Singh, DP Singh, the third VC of UPAU, was first actually involved with community development projects in Etawah. He was a part of the pilot version of community project launched at Etawah in 1948. Thereafter, he headed the Public Action Research Institute at Lucknow, which was set up with initial funding from Rockefeller. Then in 1966, he arrived at UPAU. He built his career within the state's agricultural bureaucracy. He was also very effective in cultivating a positive relationship with Americans, particularly with the University of Illinois. In 1970, he started the Tarai Seed Development Corporation to produce seeds of green revolution. This corporation was a joint venture between UPAU, rich farmers of Tarai organized in a cooperative and state agencies. Dhyan Paul Singh was its first chairman. If you lived through that area, you must have seen the white sacks of seeds with trademark Pantnagar seeds stamped on them. These were the seeds of Green Revolution. Tarai Seed Development Corporation was formed with the ambition to supply 30% of the needs of seeds of Green Revolution. UPAU focused its efforts also on building a research and extension network to support the Green Revolution project. The HYV seeds imported from Mexico were back-crossed into Indian cultivars at ICAR in New Delhi, at Jauntia village, and at Pantnagar on this university's farm. Pantnagar seeds were a symbol of the Green Revolution, not only for Uttar Pradesh, but also for Punjab and Haryana. UPAU's agronomists focused on questions of farm management suited to industrialized agriculture model and to a model of agriculture producing for markets. Technology does not pan out in the abstract, in a vacuum, in a sanitized environment. My talk today shows that, one, it is embedded within institutions like UPAU. Two, it is embedded in the wider political economy context. In this case, 1960s post-colonial state and economy. Three, the Green Revolution technology was embedded in US-India entanglements in the 1950s and 1960s. Very specifically, Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University, or as it is currently known, Govind Ballabh Pant University of Agriculture and Technology, was started at Rudrapur, Nainital district in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which now, of course, falls in the state of Uttarakhand. The university was renamed Govind Ballabh Pant Agricultural University after the death of Uttar Pradesh's first chief minister, Govind Ballabh Pant, in 1961. The establishment of UPAU signifies several moments in India's post-colonial history. One, it reflects a certain turning point in the higher education project. The higher education project of university education, which started with the Radhakrishnan Committee in 1949 to the Kothari Commission in 1964. Somewhere in the middle lies the Agricultural University, and it reflects that trend, the shift from Radhakrishnan Committee's goals to Kothari Commission's goals. Two, the founding of UPAU with the assistance of University of Illinois provides an opportunity to explore the nature of Indo-US relationship in all of its breadth. In particular, I focus on the formation of what I call an epistemic community, a knowledge community, based on constant two-way traffic of agricultural experts between India and the United States. This traffic would be started under American Point 4 program, and in particular, after a 1952 treaty between the United States and India on collaboration in the agricultural sector. This treaty was further amended in 1955 to engage 5 land grants in the United States to aid the development of India's own land grants. Thousands of students and administrators from India would be sent to land grant universities in the United States to receive their MS, PhD in different agriculture and related fields. They would come back and they would be helming research institutions. They would become administrators of research institutions. This community, my argument is, would facilitate the later arrival of high-yielding variety seeds and an Americanist model of Midwestern agricultural farming. This happened in the specific window of 1964-66, known as the New Agricultural Strategy, or known globally as the Green Revolution. But this did not happen all of a sudden. The groundwork for this had been laid by this epistemic community who had become supporters of this new kind of agricultural system. 3, what does UPAU signify? Well, UPAU came to be encumbered with the project of development, to bear the burden of development, so as to speak, as Rajeshwari Raina has said, burden of development. In particular, this university, UPAU, shaped its research and extension activities to become the bearer, ushering in the arrival of green revolution in the country, in Western UP more precisely. 4, UPAU's history can be anchored in the deeper colonial agroecological history of Tarai, which was cleared in major bouts at the end of First and Second World War to settle demobilized Indian soldiers who returned from the front lines of the 2 world wars. The Indian regiments were disbanded at the end of the wars, but the colonial state rewarded these loyal soldiers for the service by giving them lucrative land grants for farming. After partition, Tarai was settled again by Hindu and Sikh refugees by the post-colonial state. As I have suggested before, my research frames refugees and soldiers as some kind of a captive development subjects, particularly suited development subjects. And this argument is built around, a focus on experiments with refugees at Nilakari, the building of refugee colonies in urban centers all over India, in community projects, in rural resettlement and rehabilitation projects in Tarai and Punjab. Meaning soldiers and refugees, were subjects of experimentation by the state for community organization. There are 2 kinds of organization of communities. One, the organization of displaced persons, which crossed paths with plans for organization of productive agricultural communities. 5, lastly, UPAU signifies the process of the crossing of paths between agrarian visions and electoral politics in Uttar Pradesh. In particular, I have focused on the politics of Chaudhry Charan Singh, his politics favoring peasant proprietors, whom Charan Singh backed and worked on behalf of. From being the leading lieutenant of Govind Ballabh Pant and being the leading voice on UP's Zamindari Abolition Reform Act of 1950 to remove intermediaries or zamindars, Charan Singh continued to speak on behalf of land-owning cultivators, and fought for their free access to markets or mandis to sell their produce. Like Pratap Singh Karon in Punjab, Charan Singh became the voice for efficient running of mandis in Uttar Pradesh. Charan Singh developed a love-hate relationship with Uttar Pradesh Agricultural University. He was broadly in alignment with the university's goals on green revolution and the push for farmers' prosperity. But he also wrangled with the university's administrators over technical matters, always arguing that they should not blindly copy the American system. Hidden in this quibbling, I trace a deeper conflict between a political and a technical worldview. In terms of larger state electoral politics, the Green Revolution years were the ones when Charan Singh would have a rift with the Congress Chief Minister Sucheta Kripalani, leading to his exit from Congress party. While these may as well be part of the story of factionalism within the Congress party and of Charan Singh's ambition in the state that soared and was trying to fill the vacuum in leadership after Govind Ballabh Pantji's death, Charan Singh's politics was also marked by a certain conservatism in favor of rich peasantry that seemed to break ranks with the more radical Congress agrarian politics. This is Nehruvian Congress in the state at this time. The breaking point came on the issue of cooperative farming that Nehru favored and Charan Singh loathed, hated. Charan Singh believed that farmers' claim to his land's ownership should not be diluted in any way under any circumstances. Congress agrarian politics itself would renounce cooperative farming and become far more confirming subsequently. Let me see how I'm doing with time. Let me skip a few things. I should perhaps conclude here. and I should like to conclude, it would be very befitting to end this talk by a quotation from Dhyanpal Singh, which speaks to his faith in HIV seeds, and then show a few pictures of his visit to University of Illinois. Now, talking to a group of key bureaucrats in India in 1968 at Mussoorie, actually, Dhyanpal Singh implored the audience that, I'm quoting him, "A farm is like a factory." And he likened the seeds to machines. He also added, and I'm quoting him here, "The discovery of hybrid vigor is far more significant and revolutionary than the discovery of atomic power." Unquote. If possible, I would like to show just a couple of pictures here of Dhyanpal Singh. Let me see if I can quickly do a share screen here. I don't know how clearly you can see, but this is Dhyanpal Singh. This is Dhyanpal Singh on his visit in 1968 to University of Illinois with the president of University of Illinois. And lastly, Dhyanpal Singh again at University of Illinois in 1968 in conversation with university officials. Stop sharing. And that's it. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing insights on the contribution of UPAU and agriculture history of India. Now, with much delight and admiration, I'd like to welcome the conference convener, Dr. Madhumita Saha, ma'am. Dr. Saha has earned her PhD in modern South Asian history with a specialization in the agricultural history of independent India and the history of science and technology and environment. She had been a Fulbright doctoral fellow, and her dissertation has won several international prizes. Upon graduating from Iowa State University, she held full-time teaching positions at Appalachian State University, North Carolina, and Drexel University, Philadelphia. Apart from having several international publications, she is currently holding a major project grant from Indian National Science Academy. For the next 3 years, she will represent South Asia on the Internationalization Council of the US-based Organization for the History of Technology, a position she aims to utilize to foster academic collaboration between South Asian nations and the US. Thank you, ma'am, for this opportunity. I would like you to come and say a few lines for us, as it is greatly regarded. Thank you.
Thank you, Katyayani. Okay. My dear students, esteemed colleagues, respected dignitaries, and Honorable Director, Professor Nirupama Prakash, a very warm welcome to you all. I stand here today deeply indebted to you. Each one of you had shown exemplary patience while we kept on postponing the conference for the last 2 years. Then, when we ultimately decided to convene on this day and tomorrow, you have shown exceptional promptness in your responses. Leaving your professional and family commitments, you have come from near and far. My colleagues had shown the greatest sign of support. As per the academic calendar of Amity University, we are at our busiest phase with the exam starting in 1 week. And today is the penultimate day of classes. My heart warms up with a deep sense of gratitude as I see them sitting here, a sign of solid support which I need to accept in all humility. This conference is the realization of a long-held dream. When I came back from the USA after 12 years of research and teaching, I was surprised to find out how, barring the history of medicine and the history of environment, the other allied disciplines, namely history of science, history of technology, and even science, technology, and society studies are not well consolidated, while elsewhere outside India, these are thriving disciplines. Clearly, without institutional support, conference access, and lack of funding, we are sacrificing scholarly research that could have helped us to reinterpret South Asia in new light. I see myself as a lifelong student of history of science and technology. Thus, I am aware how richly nuanced and layered the field of study is. What insightful findings we can glean from pursuing it on the nature of the state, dynamics of development, complexity of power structure, the vulnerabilities of modernization projects. The list goes on. The subject taught us how difficult it is to disseminate scientific knowledge, how utopian it is to think that technology can determine society or control the environment, while revealing the rich texture of interactions between technoscience and society, environment, state. The questions of race, caste, gender, nationalities are all getting newer case studies courtesy using the lens of science, technology, environment, and medicine. I shall not bore you with a longer speech on the purpose of this conference. I trust it is self-evident. It will give us immense pleasure if we end up learning from this endeavor. We also aspire to bring science disciplines and social sciences in a state of intellectual exchanges. Thus, you will see so many prominent scientists, social scientists in this conference. We have tried to bridge the gap and have invited individuals who through their work is bridging the gap as well. My gratitude to you all. Professor Dr. Nirupama Prakash, the director of Amity Institute of Social Science, our team leader, is an example herself as how to blend the career of an academician with that of an institution builder. Encouragement will be a mild word to use. She channelizes our energy, effort, talent towards goals which we ourselves never thought was possible to achieve. Had she not been there, and this is 100% truth I'm speaking, had she not been there, I would have never applied to Indian Council of Historical Research asking for finances. By the way, the member of the Secretary of ICHR was all set to be here today, but he has sent us a message that he has meeting with HRD minister, so he didn't be here. But he has sent us again a very nice and kind message. So ICHR is doing a lot to promote history of science, technology, and medicine, as is the Indian Council of Philosophical Research and Indian National Science Academy. My earnest gratitude to them as well. My sincerest thanks to Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Balvinder Shukla, who could not join us, but she has sent a message which I read out. Now, this conference is a small step towards realizing the global vision of our Honorable Chancellor, Dr. Atul Chauhan, and respected Founder President, Dr. Ashok K. Chauhan. Their pursuit of academic excellence has inspired us to strive for it every day through our teaching, research, publications, and in terms of conferences like this. I have to end by mentioning the contributions of my students who have been nothing but heroes. Every step of the way, they were with me. They made this conference possible and worthwhile. To them, I dedicate the success of this conference. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We are somewhat behind schedule. I will ask all of us to join for high tea. It is served in the lunchroom, and then we will reconvene for our panel discussion. Thank you so much. Students, please come back. We have to reconvene for the panel discussion by the dignitaries. Please, all the paper presenters were outside. We need to come back.
A very good afternoon to everyone and welcome to today's panel discussion. I hope everyone had a great time at the inaugural session where we heard from so many exceptional individuals about their lives and work. My name is Ahana and it is my privilege to be standing here today. In the spirit of academic exploration, now we are going to have a panel discussion. The theme is Confluence, study of science, technology, and medicine from an interdisciplinary perspective. Because South Asian history of science, technology, environment, and medicine is gaining a lot of traction in academia, it is critical that we develop new ways to make the study more inventive and exciting. It is also critical that we begin to investigate new methodological techniques that will allow us to move beyond the limits of the archive. We need to look into new ways of writing these histories by collaborating with other disciplines to find new synergies. The distinguished scholars who will participate in the panel discussion will examine how histories of science, technology, and medicine can be written more incisively by incorporating a more multidisciplinary approach, such as perspectives from sociology of science, political science, anthropology, climate studies, and philosophy, to name a few. Now I take the honor to introduce our esteemed panelists, starting with Professor Ashok Acharya. Professor Ashok Acharya is an esteemed faculty in the Department of Political Science and serves as the Joint Director of the Developing Countries Research Center at the University of Delhi. Professor Ashok Acharya was also a fellow at Yale at the Henry Hart Rice Foundation at the Macmillan Center. Professor Ashok Acharya has made extensive contributions in the field of contemporary and comparative political theory, affirmative action, ethics, and public policy. Sir, it is an honor to have you here with us. Please share your thoughts with the room. But first, let me also invite on the stage our esteemed faculty, Ms. Jyotika Tekchandani, ma'am, to felicitate Dr. Ashok Acharya.
Next, we have Harish Narayan Das. Professor Harish Narayan Das is a professor of sociology. Professor Harish Narayan Das is a professor of sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University, an honorary professor at Alfred Deakin Institute, Faculty of Arts and Education, Deccan University. He was adjunct faculty at University of Iowa from 2004 to 2019. Recently, he was also held joint appointments professor of the Cluster of Excellence at the University of Heidelberg and DAD. He was visiting faculty at the Department of Anthropology, University of Heidelberg in the recent past. He made prolific contribution in history and sociology of science and medicine and has published on a range of topics, including an epistemological history of tropical medicine, a comparative history of smallpox from 18th to 20th century. His other works includes serialization of contemporary Ayurveda and many more. It is just an honor to have you here today, so please take the stage and share your wisdom with us. With great pleasure, I would like to welcome Professor Dr. Shalini for felicitating Professor Harish Narayan Das with a token of appreciation.
Next, we have among us Professor T. Jayaraman. Professor T. Jayaraman is a policy expert and senior research fellow at MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, India, and a former professor at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Professor T. Jayaraman is a theoretical physicist and has made contributions in the field of climate change and policy, the economics of climate change, and agriculture. He has also written on topics such as science policy and the history and philosophy of science. Professor T. Jayaraman leads a team that has played a crucial role in creating a climate equity monitor. Such a monitor is an online dashboard for assessing at the international level equity in climate action, inequalities in emission, energy, and resource consumption across the world. It's a privilege to have you here today, sir. Now, let me invite on the stage our esteemed faculty, Dr. Chandrakala ma'am, to felicitate Professor T. Jayaraman. My apologies. Bhavna ma'am is going to felicitate Professor T. Jayaraman today. Thank you, ma'am.
Next, we have Professor Syed Ziaur Rahman, Professor of Pharmacology at the Department of Pharmacology, Jawaharlal Nehru Medical College, Aligarh Muslim University. Professor Syed Ziaur Rahman is working in the field of pharmacology for the last 22 years. As a scholar, he has his credit 7 published books, 12 chapters, and more than 190 articles, research papers, case reports, editorials in both national and international journals. In the field of pharmacovigilance, he gave the concept of environmental pharmacovigilance, and he also coined the term pharmacoenvironmentology for the study of drugs at therapeutic doses and their impact on the environment. In addition, he is closely associated with the Society of Pharmacovigilance, India, and is currently serving as a National Secretary. Sir, it is just an honor to have you here today. Please share your thoughts with us. Now I would like to invite Dr. Rama Srivastav for felicitating Professor Syed Ziaur Rahman with token of gratitude. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Namrata Ganeri, who has come from the great city of Mumbai, gladly agreed to serve as the panel's moderator. We so very much look forward to learning from her insights. Dr. Namrata Ganeri teaches in the History Department at Srimati Natibai Damodar Thakurse College of Arts and SCB College of Commerce and Science for Women, Mumbai, since 2007. She completed her PhD in History from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has also been closely associated with 200-year-old Asiatic Society of Mumbai and served as member of Managing Committee for 2 consecutive terms. In 2018, she began a 23-month fellowship at the Center for Global Health Histories and the Department of History at the University of York, supported by the UK Commonwealth Scholarship Commission and the UK Department for International Development. We are pleased to have you here with us today, ma'am. Please join us and share a few insights. But before that, I would like to graciously welcome Professor Dr. Shipra for felicitating Professor Dr. Namrata Ganeri with a token of gratitude.
Now I invite Dr. Namrata Ganeri to take over as the moderator of this panel. Dr. Ganeri, the stage is yours.
So kind of Dr. Saha to do the introductions. My work is considerably lessened. So I think we can proceed in the order that has been presented. And I would request the speakers to speak for about 10 minutes so that towards the end, we have about 15 minutes or so for discussion. So may I invite Professor Ashok Acharya to make his presentation?
Thank you, Dr. Namrata Ganeri, fellow panelists, colleagues from Amity University. Many thanks to Dr. Madhumita Saha, Salini Saxena, Jyotika Tekchandani, many others that I know of, including the Dean, Nirupama Prakash, Professor, and for this invitation. I have never said no to any Amity event that I have been invited to. I've always gladly accepted. And this time was no different, though I was set on a little bit of thinking as to what might that confluence look like, especially when we are trying to combine the study of science, technology, and medicine from an interdisciplinary perspective. But it also meant, by and large, it also meant that we also try to bring in a kind of a humanities perspective, a social science perspective to some of these things. I have I specialize in in political theory and political philosophy, and in my own university, at the University of Delhi, we have a few courses. I have introduced a few courses which looks primarily at some of these issues in an interdisciplinary perspective. One of which I enjoyed teaching for a long time, called Ethics and Politics. And another one, which I have also loved teaching for the last couple of years, on ethics and governance. That is on the ethical choices that politics must make in the emerging areas of science and technology. And these have been, very, very fertile grounds, because I could test my students' mind and relate to them and probe them, and I've made them think deeper on some of these aspects, whether it is artificial intelligence, bioethics, and things like that, because we also want our disciplines to grow. And we also want to connect with other cognate disciplines, whether it is in the social sciences or it is from science and technology and all that. Now, one of the things that you all might agree with me is that science and technology are not value neutral. There was a time when we thought that we could make an instrumental use of this to further human progress. And that in itself, it doesn't have any kind of values. Now, in the last 80, 90 years, or more, almost almost since the Second World War, the one thing that has struck us very deep is that it's not so value neutral, that it carries its own risks, and that social scientists and humanities scholars need to pay some very serious, they need to make a serious attention, give a serious attention to the spread of science and technology. And we can't just look at it again in very broad terms. We have to somewhere ground it we have to contextualize the entire study of science and technology. And the moment we contextualize it and see it in relation to how we in society behave and interact, we find that there is a necessity of a certain kind of an interdisciplinary approach. The one thing that I would like to clear at the start, and that is that are we in a society that believes that there is some kind of a technological determinism, that it is inescapable, that will come what may? Well, most people believe that, in this kind of an outside-in idea, that science and technology grow outside of society, grow outside of the culture, grow outside of the norms, and they gradually make an impact on everything else. So that's the outside-in theory. And some people also believe, quite opposite to this view, that culture also shapes in what direction science and technology move. So call it the technological constructivism approach. So in a way, there is a culture, there are mores, there are some beliefs in a society that also guide science and technology in a certain way. And you could call this the inside-out approach. Most of the time, we take somewhere in between. We believe in a kind of a soft determinism that we cannot reverse or we cannot escape the kind of things that science does in order to shape society as it is. But we get one view, and that is, in the face of all these changes that are going around us, how good is it as an idea to regulate science and technology? That has been one of the questions that I and some of my students have raised together in the study of politics. Should we be regulating the uses of science and technology, and especially in the areas of emerging science and technology? It's here to stay, yes, but how do we regulate it? Now, technology changes exponentially, but social, economic, and legal systems change incrementally, very slowly, but technology changes exponentially. And this is an unavoidable aspect of the modern human condition. Think of artificial intelligence. I will just give you one example, and I will just draw out its implications. Later on during discussion, we can come back and rejoin this if possible. Let us say, on this whole question of artificial intelligence. Now, it is irreversible in many ways. Many people have also alluded to how the frightful five, call them the Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple, do have a certain kind of a monopoly of the data and how they use that data. Much around, around 4 years back, there was an article by Richard Epstein, who works for the American Behavioral Institute, and they came up with a very serious research on how Google can be used for altering electoral outcomes. Now, it may sound funny to you. I'm like, well, why would Google do that? It can give you some of those push ads, that you should vote for. But for the undecided voters, Epstein pointed out that both in America and in India, and especially in the 2014 elections, it said that 20% of the undecided voters can swing their votes for a particular political party. And how is it done? It is done by a simple mechanism that, what we call a search engine manipulation effect, SEME. That when you Google, let us say Rahul Gandhi or Narendra Modi or Arvind Kejriwal, you get a list of all those items right in front of your screen. But there is a certain order in which they appear. The most relevant for you may not appear at the top. They may appear somewhere later. But you get to look at the less relevant ones, and that shape your political choices, especially if you happen to be an undecided voter. Now, this is a tremendous influence on how our political behavior can be shaped. If you also, looked a little deeper into the algorithms and the uses of artificial intelligence, you would know that it can also have very gross implications for the larger society, in the sense that artificial intelligence, it is said, has an inbuilt bias to it, can exacerbate certain kinds of inequalities, can deepen certain forms of inequalities, and carries a lot of risks. Should we regulate it? Most people would say yes. But here is a dilemma. And the dilemma has been pointed out by someone who said that once the genie is out of the bottle, you cannot put the genie back into the bottle. So once technology has reached an inflection point, you cannot control it anymore. So the social consequences, and this is called the Collingridge dilemma, which is cited by Collingridge. Around 40 years back, he said this, that when a technology emerges, it is easy to change and regulate it, but that is when we don't do it. And when it develops further, it becomes, and the change is necessary, that is when we say, oh, the genie is out of the bottle, we cannot control it, regulate it anymore. So when change is easy, the need for it cannot be foreseen. When the need for change is apparent, change has become expensive, difficult, and time-consuming. So here is this catch, this Collingridge dilemma catches one of the very difficult aspects of some of the emerging areas of science and technology. How best do we govern science and technology? And this is one area that calls for a huge interdisciplinary exercise, something on the basis of which many of us can give very bright ideas. I will stop here. And because I thought that I wanted to bring in a certain kind of a flavor to the confluence between the study of politics, technology, and ethics, I think that with an closer inspection of the Collingridge dilemma, we come to terms with one of the dilemmas that faces governance today. So as long as people keep enjoying technology, they don't see a necessity of regulating it. As long as the risks start unfolding, and then you see that there is a surveillance state, or there is a state that is snooping on us with face recognition technology, mounted on every wall, as you might find in China, for instance. China has all these different, cameras. It is here also, yes. And with the growing uses of the CCTV camera, for instance. So even if you think that this phone of mine empowers, the smartphone of mine empowers, it also compromises me in many ways. And so that is the dilemma that the modern citizen faces today, that even if they think that they are empowered by technology in terms of widening their choices, but in many ways, their freedoms are severely compromised. So I'll stop here. My time is up. And if you have any questions, I will come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Acharya. Lots to think about from a very brief presentation. May I invite Professor Harish Narayan Das to make his presentation?
I'm very pleased to be here for several reasons. And to begin with, I must congratulate Madhumita for organizing a conference like this. And the reason I say that is that the history of science, technology, and medicine, or the sociology or the anthropology of what you call science, technology, and medicine is a very marginal kind of academic exercise. As Madhumita pointed out in her talk, when she came back from the US 12 years ago, she found that this is very marginal. It's absolutely true. So which is why conferences like this are most welcome. And when she invited me to come for this, I couldn't say no, because they are not very often that we see an entire conference devoted to HISTEM. So one good example of this is, for example, in my discipline, sociology and social anthropology, the leading journal is the Contributions to Indian Sociology. It was set up in 1959 by Louis Dumont and David Pocock. And the new version from 1969 or 72 was run from India. And there isn't a single article, or maybe there's just one, I think there's one exception. Except for one article, there isn't a single article by a white person on science in India. In its 63 years of existence, only one white man has written on science in India. And I think that's Bob Anderson on the bomb. And I suspect this article is not on science, but on scientists. So we must make a huge distinction. And I would strictly not call that an article on the sociology of science. And I would call that an article on the sociology of professions. So so this is an example. And how have Indians done? We haven't done much better. We haven't done much better. I think there are, for example, in the contributions, there are not more than 10 articles on what is generally called science, technology, and medicine, largely on medicine. Maybe two articles, strictly speaking, on science, one on the transistor by Shiv Vishwanathan, and the others by E.T. Abraham on the bomb. And the rest are all on medicine, including 2 by me. So this is a good example of how marginal the discipline is. Most university departments, either in history, political science, or sociology, don't have any courses on the sociology of science and medicine. Right? And in my own department, we now fortunately have 2. I am due to retire soon, then we will have 1 less. So I'm glad that we have something like this in Amity, and Madhumita is here. So I'm really delighted this is happening. Now, the other thing that happens is, why is this the case? Why is it that there's no white person who's written on science in India? Well, the presumption is that's because there is no science in India. I mean, white people only write about what is called Bharat. They don't write about India. They primarily come here to study magic and religion. And they are completely preoccupied with what is called caste. And the presumption is that India is a society of ascriptive statuses, as opposed to their own societies, which is ostensibly found on freedom and achievement. And so the whole preoccupation in my discipline is to discover why Indians are completely preoccupied with being born into something, and why are they not setting out to achieve what needs to be achieved as is supposedly done in the West. Now, this is all, so it's not surprising. Now, exactly so which means sociology and social anthropology is entirely founded on the global north, going to the global south, and studying what are called mumbo jumbo, to use a current parlance, to use a colloquial parlance. And the exception to this is that when it comes to science studies, so when it comes to science studies, or science STEM as it's called, I mean, or HISTEM, then it turns out that white people don't come to India to study science or anywhere in the global south. And most of the science studies is entirely done in the global north. And which is why Madhumita unsurprisingly said that they are thriving disciplines in the global north. And understandably, they are thriving disciplines, because when they do science studies, there are no science studies done by white people in the global south. I mean, you can literally count them. And as I said, South Asians haven't done much better. In fact, South Asians, according to me, have only one object of inquiry. They pretend to have many, but they only have one object of inquiry under different names. And that's called how to study your grandmother. Yeah, and that's what they do. I mean, South Asians primarily study their own regional, linguistic, and religious communities. And this is all they do. It's exactly the opposite of what the white man does in my discipline, and especially in sociology and social anthropology. And historians are no better. And this makes no difference. You can export as many South Asians as you want to the US. They'll all catch a flight, come back to India, and sit in the archive here and study their own communities. Bengalis will study Bengalis. Tamilians will study Tamilians. And this goes on. This has been going on for 60 years. And so it's very important that when you're in a classroom as a student, you should realize, where am I exactly situated? What is my discipline vis-a-vis all the other disciplines? And how exactly am I unconsciously being asked to constitute my object of inquiry? Right? So what I chose to do, Madhumita wanted me to speak about my own work, but my own work is entirely tied up with this. I come from, fortunately, a department which is an exception because we've had science studies being taught in my department from 1978. It's a very, very long-standing. My own supervisor inaugurated it. I think he published a book in 1978 called Science and Culture. And he did several things with that publication of the book. So what I did, I followed suit insofar as the fact that I didn't want to do conventional social anthropology. And conventional social anthropology means studying your grandmother. It also means studying what are called studying down. It usually means studying disenfranchised subjects. And I wanted to study up, and it also meant I wanted to study science and technology. And I doubled up as a historian, and I decided to study the discipline of tropical medicine. And in my time, the presumption was that all my colleagues, all my white colleagues in the global north, they had constituted tropical medicine as an object of inquiry, where tropical medicine was to be explained in terms of its colonial encounter and the quiddity called the tropical weather. So between climate, under the sign of climate, and under the sign of empire, explanations on the inauguration of this discipline was largely being explained. While I disagreed with this, and I wanted to argue, and I have argued, that if you really want to understand what is happening in the tropics, you need to understand what is happening in the templates. That you need to actually write a common history of the global north and the global south in a single canvas. And unless you do that, you're going to produce very warped histories. A very good example of this is David Arnold. I'm deliberately invoking him, and he's an iconic figure. And the reason is that you then say that the kind of medicine that's being practiced in India is modified by the adjective called colonial. And you have something called colonial medicine, and medicine, when it's practiced in the colonies, is warped. And presumably, when medicine is practiced back in the home country, everything is hunky-dory. Nothing could be further from the truth. But the fact remains that this is how histories are written. They're written in silos. So you have one set of people who are writing on the global north and the other set of people writing on the global south. So I decided not to do this. So I necessarily had to travel abroad. So I did what would today be called multi-sided archival work. So I had to do archival work in Paris and in London and in Washington, DC, and in Baltimore at Hopkins. But unlike other historians, I didn't spend time sitting in the India Office library. I primarily spent time at the Wellcome Trust Library looking at medical texts. And the reason is that if you do this, if you primarily are going to study medicine in the colonies under the modifier of colonial, then medical epistemology, the cognitive part of medicine, is black boxed. And then you produce very strange kind of histories. And I tried not to do this. And I've made the argument that unless you understand the templates and the tropics as part of one common canvas, you're going to produce warped histories. But if you do, you're going to produce a very different kind of history, which is what I've tried to do all my life. First with tropical medicine, subsequently with smallpox. And currently, in the last 10 years, I've spent time doing field work in Germany as far as studying psychiatry and psychosomatic medicine. And the argument again is that if you make Germany the center of the universe as far as medicine is concerned, rather than the Anglophone world, then you get a very different picture between medicine and alternative medicine, the way it's practiced in Germany. And the argument is that in Germany, magic, science, and religion are all fused in very interesting ways. Unfortunately, I've run out of time and I can't talk about this. But the takeaway from this is, A, you should study up and not study your grandmother. B, the next step is we should do a kind of what is called reverse history and reverse anthropology and make the global north the object of inquiry from the global south. And unless you do this, you will not be able to decolonize either sociology or anthropology or history. And that's the sum and substance of the argument I want to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Narayan Das. I was taking furious notes, and probably I'll have lots of questions for you during the discussion. May I invite Professor Jayaraman to speak? I've decided to speak last. I have changed the order from the schedule. Thank you.
So we only have 10 minutes at our disposal, so I'll be brief. I'll divide my remarks into two parts. And the first is some highlights of a research program that we had at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences with 3 or 4 students, MPhil and PhD, who participated actively in it. One of them, Dr. Sandeepan Bakshi, is here. You can hear him later in the parallel session. I want to very briefly speak about our program. And we want to speak about it because we come to conclusions that are dramatically different from what Prakash Kumar presented in his keynote address. So I think that's a useful dialectic to have at this meeting. The second point I want to make is that the difficulties of science studies in India have been compounded. It's a discipline which, to start with, was on difficult terrain, but subsequently it has further, the crisis of science studies in India, if I may say so, has deepened because of global trends in the study of science as a part of society, social activity, that has made our problems more difficult. So let me begin with the first. The first is that there is, if you go back to the colonial period, it is very clear that development is not a project simply of the state. It is a project ardently desired by an anti-imperialist movement that drew vast sections of Indian society over time with varying degrees of engagement. But the fact that the average Indian's life was extraordinarily short, that life expectancy was the order of 25 to 30 years in the pre-independence era, and that we needed independence, not a post-colonial state, as if the state simply acquired some transition, though its machinery may have done so superficially, but that you needed a new vision of a new India. This was something that animated life across the political spectrum. And one of the things in our research program we did was to notice, of all reasons, sparked off by a remark by William Dalrymple on postmodern historians, is a very odd place to begin, but is pointing out that overwhelmingly the history of colonial India was being written from English language sources. So we spent a lot of time in looking at sources in Hindi. We have looked extensively at Bengali and in Marathi. Now, if I get more students, I'll do all the other languages, I assure you. And we see the formation of this odd term, but I will use it to keep our discussion simpler, that the epistemic community, at least in agricultural research, was taking place well before independence. And Tagore, for instance, was very keenly interested in agriculture. The Bengal literati were deeply involved in the question of the development of agriculture. And extraordinarily, my student found, Pankaj Sarkar, that the Bengal's leading in the pre-independence period, their leading literary association devoted one day of their annual session to discussing literature about agriculture in the Bengali language. And so they systematically went to study. Tagore sent his son, I think, or his brother, I forget, son to Japan to study. And the epistemic community was not simply a US India interaction, but it spanned the entire globe. And they came back imbued with the question of how to present this in the language, how to carry new agricultural techniques and knowledge to improve productivity in the actual conditions of agriculture in the regions. And so there was this extraordinary ferment. So the development project is not even a project. If you have 25 years life expectancy and you have been through the famines of Victorian India, culminating in the famine of the Great Bengal famine. And if you, as even a person like me, saw the last of the smallpox epidemics in the early 60s when I was a school student, then in these circumstances, development, to call it a project of the state, whether colonial or post-colonial, seems to me a very sort of limited framing of the question, if I may put it so politely. So I think the whole question here, I think the problem arises then of what is it about science studies that the point I'm trying to make. And what I would like to say is, first of all, the question of science studies in India, unfortunately, because of the Bernal tradition and Haldane, etc., the history of and philosophy of science in India, scientists thought that they could do it themselves. Nothing could be farther from the truth, okay? Because Bernal, Haldane, etc. were pioneers, but very soon the history of science was a discipline. The history of science also had its own independent history earlier, maybe perhaps too internalist. Bernal probably is a pioneer of a more external history. But at the same time, the idea somehow that scientists could talk about science and how science developed, and that constitutes the history of science, was a very unfortunate beginning. Then, of course, as Kosambi acidly remarked, all these leaders went to jail, and then they had some spare time, and then they thought they could dash off histories, which were then to be taken seriously. But of course, we got the idea of scientific temper out of that, so I don't think we should quarrel too much with that. But so this whole idea of science, the philosophy and history of science as a scientific, as a discipline, interdisciplinary to begin with, but then an interdisciplinary thing becomes the nucleus of a new discipline, like biochemistry, biophysics, molecular biology. They are all interdisciplinarities that then become new disciplines. That's the dialectic. So, you know, we never got there. There were some putative attempts with the NISTADs and the center in JNU, but it is, yes, a couple of minutes. But it is a remarkable fact that in this country, where we so ceaselessly talk of scientific temper, okay, and the role of science and technology in development, we devote zero attention to its serious study. However, if this problem could have been set right in the 80s and 90s, this has been severely undermined by the broad sense of skepticism towards science and technology that has gripped our social sciences. So I think this is a long subject, whether it is in the form of Foucauldian biopolitics or Gandhian, return to our, not the Gandhi of a later period, but the Gandhi of, what was it? His Hind Swaraj. So this unfortunate echoes, whether it is one or the other, and the entry of environmentalism and environmental history has brought forward not a critical view, but in an unfortunate lapse, I believe, into outright romanticism. So our history of science, our sociology of science today faces an even more uphill task than we had perhaps in the 80s, when there could have been a window of opportunity. And I must say, I feel that the social science communities have simply somehow not been able to countenance the rise of this as an independent discipline. So everybody is an expert on science and technology. So when everybody is engaged with science and society, unfortunately, nobody seems to be engaged as well with science and technology. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sticking to time, everyone. I really feel very miserable waving those little chits, but I have to do it. May I invite Professor Rahman to give his address?
Thank you so much, Dr. Namrata. Respected my co-panelists, participants, and all the speakers who had the presentation in the morning session. At the very outset, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Dr. Madhumita Saha, for inviting me to this panel session. Actually, when I was discussing my topic with Dr. Madhumita Saha, she suggested me if I speak something about my own subject. In fact, it's not my subject, but it's something on Unani medicine. My forefathers were all Unani practitioners. I inherited many medical manuscripts. So I would like to tell you about our own institute, Ibn Sina Academy of Medieval Medicine and Sciences. There's just a newsletter of this Ibn Sina Academy. So what I thought is you all medical scientist or historian, you would also like to work on medical manuscripts. So medical manuscriptology is also one of the subjects which you can also study. But thing is, you should have access to the primary source or the original manuscript. That is very important. So we thought that we should collect medical manuscripts. So in our library, we have around 1,300 manuscripts, and out of 1,300, we have around 500 manuscripts only on the medicine. So we have few manuscripts which are very rare. One of the manuscripts is rare of the rarest manuscript, which is the commentary of Galen. Galen, you know, all know that it's a Roman physician. He was taught all over the Europe till 13th century. And we have a complete commentary of Galen. It's a textbook of the Galen, which was scribed in 10th century by Honan ibn Ishaq, who was a Syrian Christian. And he translated this work in Arabic, and later on, many scientists work on. Likewise, we have manuscripts on geriatrics, which was scribed in around 1500 AD, around 500 years ago. It was written by Muhammad al-Harawi, who came with Babur to India. And he wrote a very good, very comprehensive book on geriatrics. Like in these days, we talk about geriatrics, but imagine he is talking about aging and the process of aging and what drugs would be helpful in controlling aging. So that is also a good thing which we can work on. Likewise, we have, I'm just giving an example. We have Risala Afyun, which was written by Imaduddin Shirazi. It is also one of the rare manuscripts. It's all about opium, addictive properties of opium and the medical properties of opium. Similarly, we have manuscripts on nabis. Nabis is basically a drink which was consumed by most of the Arabs. It's like alcohol. It's fermentation. It's prepared through fermentation. That is also translated by Qusta ibn Luqa. So we also have a very good periodical section, and many scholars used to come to our academy. In fact, one Fulbright scholar, she was working on, for example, when Britishers came to India, they were trying to introduce allopathy system of medicine. And at that time, many Ayurvedic physicians and Unani physicians were writing editorials against allopathy system of medicine. So she was interested to study the editorials which were written during the British time. So we should have access to those periodicals also. So we have periodicals in our library also. Then in addition to publications which we do in the translation of the primary sources, and then we have a good collection on other printed books also. For example, Ibn Sina has written Qanun fi Tib, which is the canon of medicine, and again it was taught all over the Europe. So we have this canon of medicine and its translation into Hebrew, into English, into Russian, into Uzbek translation, and Urdu translation also. And likewise, his other contemporary books also, they are extant in our library. Then we also thought that to study the history of medicine, we should have a museum. So Government of India, Ministry of Ayush established this National Institute of History of Medicine in Hyderabad. But you'll be happy to know that our institute, our academy has a rich medical heritage if you compare with this National Institute of History of Medicine. So what we thought is we should have a museum also. So in the museum, we have a very good medical heritage. We used to tell medical students, for example, we have a bust and statues of, for example, Pluto, his student Aristotle, father of biology. Again, his student Theophrastus, father of botany. Likewise, we have the statues and bust of Hippocrates, Socrates, Artemis, the goddess of fertility, Artemis' twin brother Apollo, and the son of Apollo, the Asclepius, the father of physician. So, and we have also categorically arranged these things in chronology. For example, medicine during the Mesopotamia period, Babylonian period in one section. Then after Mesopotamia period, medicine during Egyptian period. After Egyptian, how Greek adopted Egyptian medicine, so history of Greek medicine. Then history of Roman, then history of Arab or Arab medicine. And parallel to the Greek medicine, we have also displayed history of Indian physicians. Or so we don't have the scanned copy of the photographs which are available in the internet, but we have the primary or the actual replicas and actual memoirs. And likewise, in India, we have two school of thoughts in the Unani system of medicine: Lucknow school of thought and Delhi school of thought. So you people are residing in Delhi, so you must have heard about Hakim Ajmal Khan. So he inherited many things from his forefathers. So this family is called as Sharifi family. So they have Sharifi Manzil in Old Delhi also. So Sharifi family, or this school of thought, which is the Delhi school of thought, they were in the favor of compound medicine. They prepared formulations. The Lucknow school of thought, they were interested to study the single form of the drug or the single drug, not in the formulation. So, for example, Aligarh Tibia College followed the Lucknow school of thought. Delhi's medical, like for Hamdard University, they followed the Delhi school of thought. So, that's what I thought. It's better if you people can come to Aligarh Ibn Sina Academy, see this academy, and try to study history of medicine in your own town. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. I think I'll keep time for myself. I can do that. Or if someone would like to keep time for me. Yeah. Thank you. So when I was invited for this panel, I asked like all good speakers do. What should I speak on? And Madhumita Dee said, why don't you speak about your work? And I thought it was very apposite because I'm a new entrant to the field of history of science and technology. This is a work that is quite different from my doctoral work and subsequent work, but I'm trying to see some threads that bind my interests, for example, in personalities, for example, in writing biographies, and so on and so forth. So let's see what I can do with this project. So this is a project which was funded by the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission for looking at India during the global smallpox eradication program. As some of you may have already picked up, it's the only disease to have been eradicated by purposive human efforts, only human disease. It's a unique example of collaboration during the Cold War. It has not been replicated since. Also, a program that was being directed by the Geneva-based World Health Organization. The historian Nancy Steppen makes a very interesting observation. She says that the global eradication can be seen as having taken too long. If you think of the fact that, of Jenner's discovery of the vaccine and smallpox's final eradication around 1980. Or on the short side, if we look at what institutional histories have told us, if you look at what chroniclers have told us, if you look at what smallpox warriors have told us, then it's just 10 years between 1967 and 1977 that this feat was achieved. In 1958, the eradication proposal came actually from Soviet delegates who also pledged vaccine. It was not taken very seriously, and in 1966, a smallpox eradication unit was set up in Geneva with an American heading this institution, Dr. Donald Henderson, and he was from the CDC. And thereafter, the countries in Asia, Africa, and South America were asked to commit themselves to this global campaign. India was one of the main contributors to smallpox because by 1950s, Europe and Northern America was largely smallpox free, and you had smallpox coming in only by importations, travelers, migrants, and so on and so forth. So this period between 1967 and 1977 has received the lion's share of attention. And I am trying to change this perspective. I'm shifting attention to the decade between the period, the decade prior to the intensive program. At this point of time, you might be aware that smallpox in the subcontinent was seen as endemic. India was seen as a land which was predisposed, India and Pakistan and what is today Bangladesh, and it would occur cyclically. So there were 5 to 6 year cycles. And in 1958, there were two major epidemics, smallpox and cholera. Now, what happens to cholera, we really don't know, but definitely smallpox becomes an urgent priority for the government of India, and an intensive crash program is launched for 3 years. What do you think happened after? Did India win this battle? Did India lose this battle? In the official histories, this program is called a grand failure. 1962, the year saw a return of smallpox, Many more people dying than even earlier. The people leading the program were utterly demoralized and defeated. And it also broke the morale of the Indian government. And Indian government just thought that we should just call it off. So looking at this period, looking at this period of failure or so-called failure, gives us some things to think about as well. What did we do in that period? Can we think of some things that were done right? And this is what my work is trying to argue. It's trying to say that this period actually provided the template for a reorientation of the global strategy. India's scientific and medical elite in the smallpox eradication program at this point of time found themselves in global committees. The first committee ever to discuss smallpox at the World Health Organization was formed in 1964, and two Indians, and you see them here on the screen, two Indians formed themselves on this committee. You see Dr. Lal, who actually head the National Smallpox Eradication Program from 1962 to 1967. And you see another remarkable individual called Dr. Ayagiri Ramchandra Rao, who was based in Madras, and I'll speak more about him in a minute, as important faces of the program. Now, Dr. Lal was heading the program in India, and it was but obvious that he received quite a lot of important positions in the WHO bureaucracy at this point of time. He actually also led a special commission that was set up to look at smallpox eradication all over the world. But 1966, fortunes change and he sort of just slips. I have really been trying to trace his records and I've been largely unsuccessful. But when we turn to Ramchandra Rao, we see that he was just not a bureaucrat. He was actually a scientist. He was conducting research on clinical smallpox, infectiousness of smallpox, comparison of freeze-dried and liquid vaccines, and so on. And since this disease had already been eliminated from the so-called Western world, Madras became the center for many scientists to come and study and see smallpox, because doctors and clinicians in those parts of the world didn't even know what a smallpox pustule looked like. So what was the clinical manifestation of the disease? So this was something like a living laboratory, and research was conducted in Madras in multinational teams, Americans and British social medical scientists, funded through the WHO, and they published their results in the WHO's publication. This was not the first time of collaboration between Indian and American and British scientists. I'm reminded of Professor Prakash Kumar's reference to a constant traffic between Indians and Americans. And in the 1950s, it was a long trail that was that had actually begun in the 1940s. And you have a lot of work being done by all these social scientists and clinicians in Madras, and publishing their work in the WHO Medical Bulletin. Rao went on to publish a textbook of smallpox in 1972. It was based on his case study of 7,000 smallpox patients. And he also prolifically published in various Indian journals. I have tried to track some of his publications. This, for instance, is a very badly scanned copy of Indian Journal of Public Health. You know, at this point of time, it's also important to remember that the 1964 committee was immediately followed by another smallpox advisory expert committee, which was formed in 1968 under the leadership of the new WHO smallpox chief, that is D.A. Henderson, and it totally overturns all the advice that was given in the 1964 committee.
So everything that was advised based on India's experience is overturned, and a new strategy, and a so-called new strategy, is unveiled. Rao is here as well. He remains an important figure, and that's quite interesting that Lal sort of slips through these webs of bureaucratic communication, but Rao continues, and he is also part of the 1968 committee. So my recounting of these instances of borderless intellectual exchanges or entanglement and foregrounding of Indian actors is not an attempt at a proto-nationalist rendering of a global smallpox eradication campaign. Decentering the global West does not really mean creation of new centers. Surely there were tensions between different elements of the public health bureaucracy in India, and this shaped the ground level campaign. But we could ask, for instance, as to why have the histories of research of biomedical knowledge production never been put in conversation with ground level campaigns? One could ask if there were any limits or boundaries to this flow of information. As we continue to question global asymmetries of public health, we must also challenge the asymmetries in our own global histories. And this brings me to my final point before I draw to a close, and that is historiographically, when we try to decenter the WHO perspective, it's rather challenging because of our over-reliance on the WHO's own smallpox eradication archive. Working towards a bottoms-up approach meant that I complement the sources in the WHO archives with Indian publications, with journals, with government communication, to sort of inform me how was India communicating the program to its own population. I also want to comment on a standard refrain of the paucity of archival material in settings like ours. I'm still looking for Indian language material, responses, participant histories, and so on, but the search continues. One can either lament about the paucity or inadequacy of sources or questions of representation, or find newer ways to surface the voices of Indian participants in the program. It is often said that we really don't know what were women doing during the smallpox campaign, especially when we compare this to the hyper visibility of women now and the issues faced by women now, for example, during the COVID pandemic. Here we have little girls and a woman vaccinator. Probably we need to revisit sources like this to tell an Indian story of the global smallpox eradication program. Thank you so much. Okay, I will do that. Thank you all the panelists for making your presentations. Also to the audience who might be really hungry. We have to now move towards the lunch setting, and we will carry on our conversation, discussion, questions, comments, and nice things to say to each other during lunch.
I can't thank enough the panelists and Dr. Namrata Ganeri here for conducting the session. It kept me yearning so much to hear more on each of the discussion, but we have to stop. The reason being, this hall is going to another department for their conference. We have to break out for lunch now so that we can start the parallel sessions in time. During the lunch hour, I have arranged it at the back of this hall in the corridor. The only reason being, I really want to transform that lunch into a session where we can speak, discuss, argue, and maybe even fight a little. Okay, thank you. See you at the lunch.